Hard brag.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Priyamvada Naik. I'm a triple board certified physician in pulmonary medicine, critical care medicine, and lifestyle medicine. I also have a background in lung transplantation and ECMO. There's a whole bio that I could read to you that would just be very boring. I do need to just mention a couple things very quickly. So one, I have no disclosures, meaning I have no conflicts of interest. I should mention that I am on the advisory committee for the Plant-Based Network, and I have been vegan for 10 years, but the reason I recommend plant-based nutrition is not because I'm vegan, because that's what the evidence shows. And so today we just kind of wanted to talk about what what is new with COVID. The last two things I want to mention is you are very likely to hear my dog. He seems to have a knack for figuring out when I'm on a live Zoom and barking through it. And then the other thing is, once again, I forgot I'm on call. So hopefully I will not get called. If I do, you might see me break for just a second and either answer the phone and just make sure that the person in the ICU is stable, and then I can call them later. There you go. Perfect. Please, I constantly am amazed by the absolute confidence, which with non-medical people will give medical advice on the internet. Me? I really liked I, Tonya. But let me just, while we're talking, or while people are listening, we had planned on doing this interview at some point anyway, and then we found out about Sweet Bear. So of course, as vegans, we wanted to make sure that we could somehow tie it in and help folks. So I'll shut up now and let Lisa. Oh,
All right, we are back. Okay, great. So we should be back live on Facebook. And I am going to once again just stop and start that. And then I will listen in. I'm so sorry about this, everybody. I really thought I had all this ironed out before we started. So while I'm waiting for that, since we are here with our audience right now, Lisa, could you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about you and about Sweet Bear?
Yep, sure can. So first, I just want to say thank you so much to both of you for taking the time and the energy to take a very important discussion and turn it into something really wonderful that's going to hopefully help quite a few animals. I am the founder and director of Sweet Bear Rescue Farm, which is an almost 4-acre vegan animal sanctuary in North Carolina, about 25 miles south of Asheville. Since COVID began, I have been the solo caregiver for these animals. So I currently share a home with nearly 30 chickens, 8 cats currently, 5 dogs, 2 pigs, 2 turkeys, and 2 goats. So I definitely have my hands full. I usually have live-in help. It just hasn't really worked out that way this year. And with COVID, a lot of people are pressed for money. My previous income stream kind of disappeared. I can get into that if you guys want to talk about that. But really, at the end of the day, this conversation is meant to help us as people, and that's human and non-human. So you might get a chance to see a few of them. If you were looking a few minutes ago, my piglet Benjamin was behind me. It's a little late for his dinner time, so he might come over and tell me what he thinks about me doing a live stream instead of feeding him. We'll find out.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Oh, and great. Someone who is watching this on Twitch said that she could hear you. So now
Okay.
I'm wondering if she can hear me as well. And if she says that she can hear me, I'm going to trust that that means it's working on all 4 platforms. I haven't got a notification yet to let me know whether we are currently live on Facebook, but and yes, we are live. She can hear us perfectly on Twitch, so I'm going to trust that everything is up and running. And by the way, Lisa, so if you guys are like, I remember that voice from somewhere. I remember that voice getting me through a difficult time and teaching me how to take care of myself. You have heard Lisa on a past episode of Big Fat Vegan Radio. It was her talk at the Asheville Veg Fest on self-care for activists. And in fact, this is so special for me to have the two of you, and Helene from Triangle Veg Fest is also here in the Zoom audience as well. who brought all of us together. But I was emceeing the Asheville Veg Fest, and it was after hearing Priyamvada's talk on how to talk to your doctor about being vegan. And it wasn't just the talk, it was like the effect that had on the audience. Like, people were like just so like on the edge of their seats and engaged, and I realized I missed a golden opportunity to record a really great talk and put it on the podcast. But then I saw what Lisa was going to talk about, and I'm like, could we? And I thought you were going to be like, I worked hard on this. You don't just get to take this and make free content. Like, in my mind, I'm always like, it's always a big ask. And you were like, that would mean so much to me. So it meant so much to me that it meant so much to you. And now I love that we have that episode up there together. And then shortly after that, I had Priyamvada come back on the show to give her own podcast episode version of that talk.
I love that so much. That is probably the favorite talk I have ever given. It meant a lot to me. What most people don't know, and Helene can attest to this, I was going through some really major personal issues at that time. I had just ended a 13-year relationship, and there were, I think, 2 people in the room that knew that that's kind of what that upswell of emotion and like learning about myself and my mental health, where that all came from. So that day was really special to me. And the fact that you created something that allowed it to be like reshared over and over is so beautiful. I've gotten amazing comments about it, and I hope it's really helped people.
Isn't
so
that great?
You're just putting all the love out there.
Aw, thank you. Lord knows, I have some story. Like, there's a story about how I won the affordable housing lottery, and I once told the entire story with every detail on a podcast called Tell the Bartender. So now I never have to tell that story again. When people ask, well, how did you get the housing lottery? I'm like, listen to this episode. It's all recorded. If anyone's just now watching the live stream, I'm not going to have either of you reintroduce yourselves, because I figure that they already heard that when they were watching the previous snippet of the live stream. So I'll just say before we start, if you are watching this on the live, if you're here with us in the Zoom, you aren't necessarily well, if you're hearing this in the Zoom, it's because you already donated, and thank you so much. I'm happy to say we've already raised $165, but that's only from the people who already saw the post about it, from the people that I emailed, from the people that are friends with me on Facebook and saw this. For those people who are currently watching on the live stream on Periscope, Twitch, Facebook, or YouTube, and if you would like to donate, there's a link right here on the bottom of your screen. You can go to bigfatveganradio.com/donate link. It was late. I was out of creative juices. That's what we're calling it. I was afraid that if I just said donate, that I already was using that for something, and I didn't feel like going to check. Okay. Oh, wonderful. So, sorry, I'm reading comments here. So, for those of you who would like to donate during this, you can go there, use that link, or if you know how to use a QR scanner thing, you can just hold your phone up and scan the QR code in the bottom corner of this. And I mostly did that not just for convenience, but just to make me look really cool and sophisticated and high tech. So with that said, Priyamvada, do you want to kick us off with some of your updates about coronavirus and how to avoid it and I don't even know where to start or like what to say first. Oh, but go ahead and unmute yourself as well. There we go.
So sorry, if you see me looking back, it's because I'm trying to get the dog to lay down and not run off and bark at somebody walking down the street.
Sure.
So I had emailed you the question, so I'll do like a little intro, and then maybe just have you ask me the questions.
Perfect.
Just so that we're all sort of starting at the same level, all on the same page. Coronavirus is a human virus. It's what we call a spillover or zoonotic virus. And what that means is it is a virus that exclusively comes from animals, mutates, and then ends up spilling over into humans. So again, these types of diseases would not exist if we were not confining animals and using them and encroaching on their territories and things like that. So there are 4 major coronaviruses that we tend to have a human effect for. So everything from the common cold, which is obviously very mild and we usually can get over that pretty easily. SARS and MERS were also coronaviruses. So SARS was severe acute respiratory syndrome and MERS was Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. When we think about viruses, there's a couple different things that can make a virus either become a really big problem or really not that much of a problem. So while we heard about SARS and MERS, it really never hit our shores. And the reason for that is the incubation period was different, the infectivity was different, the fatality was different. So it was a pretty fatal disease, but it was hard to get it. So it wasn't something that was easily spread. Unfortunately, SARS-CoV-2, which is what we're dealing with right now, which causes COVID-19, COVID-19 stands for coronavirus disease. The 19 means 2019, meaning that's when it first occurred in China. It does not mean that it's the 19th coronavirus or anything like that.
Just in case Kellyanne Conway is watching this.
Yeah, yeah. So there are a ton of, myths out there. So for example, we've heard everything from, it was created in a lab. It was not created in a lab. If you Google nature.com and you Google the proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2, you can read all about how they did the genomic sequencing. The military has also confirmed that this is not a virus that was created in a lab. So there are some myths that we're still struggling with. And I think sort of the overriding concern that we have when it comes to coronavirus is, unlike any other time period in history, so for example, when we had H1N1, people believed the experts. There wasn't this sort of constant questioning of, well, why would this be happening? Why would this be happening? So some of that is on the public and sort of how politics has changed our perceptions. When politicians routinely attack doctors and scientists, of course, we're going to have doubting and things like that. But the other part of that, and this is a frustration that I have, is in an effort for other doctors all over the world to get the information quickly, one thing that has happened this time around that's unique is that we are publishing non-peer-reviewed data online. And unfortunately, what's happening is it's not just doctors and scientists that are looking at it. The press gets a hold of it. They do what the press does beautifully, which is misunderstand medical studies. And then they publish stuff that doesn't actually make sense. So I kind of wanted to go through sort of the latest stuff. I think everybody kind of understands that, we have, sort of what are the things that we should do, what are the things we shouldn't do. If people want to look at images of what SARS-CoV-2 does, they can look at my talk with the Afro-Vegan Society. I did a 2-part talk for them. Part 1 is all about SARS-CoV-2 and what it's doing to people, and there's CT images and things like that. And then part 2 is why is it affecting Black, Indigenous, and people of color disproportionately.
Yeah.
Although that is changing, that is one of the updates. So, for example, in places in the Deep South, we are actually now seeing in certain pockets, white people are sort of climbing in their numbers disproportionate to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We don't know why that is. The hypothesis is that the people who tend to be the anti-maskers, the people who don't want to wear masks or are concerned about masks, and we'll talk about that today, they tend to be Caucasian. And so that would make sense that, if you're not wearing a mask, that it would spread. And we'll get to that in a minute. But Ben, do you want to just sort of go through each point in that email? And then obviously at the end, if people have questions, we'll talk about all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think some of them you've already hit. We were just talking about, it's so rare that I hear it called SARS-CoV-2, but it sounds very official. And you were talking a bit about the racial groups and how there's been like a racial disparity. I know one of the probably better known disparities when this started off was the age disparity. Like I remember back in my day, I remember a time when we literally just thought babies and like small toddlers and kids couldn't get it. So any changes
Yeah,
that?
so, we realized pretty quickly that what we were seeing was very different. So, for example, if you look at the CDC morbidity mortality weekly report from, I want to say it was like March 16th, what we found was if you look at hospitalized patients, 60% of hospitalized patients are actually below 65. This isn't an adult hospital, so they're between the ages of like 18 and 64. That was unexpected. We were not expecting the largest proportion of people in the hospital to be that young. Of course, the other stuff we were expecting. So, for example, above like 65 to 75, there was a pretty high incidence of mortality. It was like 8%. Above 75, it was like 15%. Obviously above 80, it's very, very high. So, we were expecting those kinds of numbers. We were not expecting that young people were going to get it. As far as children go, initially we weren't seeing young kids get it, but then initially we were isolating young children, right? Like everyone was worried about it. So there was this, should they be in school? Should they not be in school? So that was part of it. And then of course, now we've seen things like the, multi-system inflammatory response syndrome that we're seeing. We've even seen deaths in young kids. We know more about the comorbidities that are associated with it. So for example, initially we noticed that heart disease, lung disease, high blood pressure, that these were all potential problems. One of the things that I think people, there is a lot of skepticism about, well, why, we keep changing the story. Why are doctors saying one thing and then 2 months later, they're saying something else? What you're seeing is science in real time, right? So we think one thing, we understand one thing based on the data. We keep actively collecting data. We analyze it. We do these interim analyses. And then we go, oh, hang on. So we are a little bit different than, say, China or Spain or Italy or South Korea or one of those places. So that's why you're seeing things change. It's not that people are lying to you or that we're just sort of arbitrarily, randomly deciding that we want to make people look silly by wearing masks. It's that, initially we have these ideas and then it turns out that we get new data. And so then we realize other things, for example, with kids. Another thing that we did not know early on was typically, when we see people with respiratory illness, they're always at risk for something called ARDS, which is acute respiratory distress syndrome. It's characterized by very low oxygenation and very stiff lungs. There's damage to the lungs. There's an influx of inflammatory material into the air spaces. And it's basically what we call pulmonary edema. So if you imagine a sponge is your lung and then you imagine a wet sponge, right? If your air sacs are filled with fluid and inflammatory stuff, then the oxygen that comes into your air sacs cannot diffuse into your bloodstream. And that's how we get oxygen to the rest of our organs. It's carried by the blood to the rest of the organs. There's an image in the Afro-Vegan Society talk that I do that shows all of this. So initially we were thinking, okay, this is behaving the same way that, say, for example, the flu does with ARDS, although we never thought it was like the flu, because we saw so much more ARDS than we've ever seen with the flu. But what we started noticing is there was this other phenotype that some people are calling happy hypoxia. And what was happening is people were coming to the hospital with fevers and coughs and chills, but they weren't having the typical symptoms of a low blood oxygen level. But then when you slap a pulse ox on them, you go, how are you not feeling this? Your oxygen levels are 85%. And so what we started realizing is there's sort of a unique phenotype with SARS-CoV-2. Some people are calling it COVID ARDS. And it's where you have a lot of the same features of ARDS, but the lungs are not as stiff. And a lot of the oxygenation problems are not so much from the flooding of the lungs, but because you're forming little blood clots in the blood vessels themselves. And so if you're clotting up your blood, the blood is not active, it's not able to be used. So that's sort of that area. The things that are kind of new are, we've known for a while that coronavirus the reason we call it coronavirus is it's an RNA strand surrounded by a protein coat. And then there's these proteins that kind of stick out of it and it kind of looks like a crown. So that's where corona comes from. And what we have realized is that that protein is called the S protein or the spike protein, and that locks onto the ACE2 receptor in our cells, and that's the entry point. Recently, we have realized it's not probably that simple. There is some evidence that there's another receptor that's involved, and the reason we think it might be involved is because when you block that receptor in studies, it's much harder to become infected with SARS-CoV-2. So we feel like it's at least a 2-part thing, maybe a 3-part thing. So that's a new thing. I'm gonna just pull up that, okay, there we go. So we've talked about mechanism of infection, we've talked about complications. Another thing that we didn't realize before, Ben, when you and I talked in, the first 2 updates we did, there just hadn't been enough time to collect data on people who were actively infected and then recovered, right? We were still in the, oh crap, everyone's getting infected phase. Yeah. And now what we're seeing is some stuff that you just don't see with things like the flu. So before I get to that, I just want to bring up a couple things because bizarrely, I'm still hearing it's just like the flu, okay? Here's why it's not like the flu. Number 1, we do not have a vaccine that noticeably, appreciably reduces the risk that you'll get it. And if you do get it, that you're going to have a mild version of it. Okay. Yeah. Number 2, there are 5 drugs on the market, 4 that are FDA approved, 1 that can be used in Europe, that actually are proven to shorten the duration and severity of the flu. So, for example, I was in a hospital, a guy came in with COPD, he was in severe respiratory distress. I took one look at him and I was like, I don't even know what's going on with this guy. I just walked in, he needs to go on a ventilator. There's no way he can continue doing this. He's gonna code in the next 5 minutes. And sure enough, his heart rate starts dropping. I put him on the ventilator. I do a bronchoscopy to get a sample from his lung to figure out why this happened. My mask had slipped down during the intubation, right? So he's breathing in my face. We got the sample back and he was flu positive. So immediately he went on Tamiflu and I went on Tamiflu, right? That is not an option right now for coronavirus, for COVID-19, right? For SARS-CoV-2. So that's one way it's very different. Like I said, it's causing ARDS in a completely different way and in a very severe way. And that is very different from the flu as well. Typically, if someone gets the flu...
Can I ask a quick question just as far as terminology?
Yeah.
In case people don't know, and I have a guess, but what does it mean if somebody codes?
Oh, so it basically just means they have a cardiac arrest or a respiratory arrest. So either their heart stops or they stop breathing. So what was happening to this gentleman is he had started out very tachycardic. His heart rate was really, really high. And that was because he just wasn't able to breathe and get enough oxygen, and the body's response is speed up the heart rate so we can pick up the oxygen faster. And then just as I was getting ready to intubate him, his breathing dropped and his heart rate dropped. And you would think that's a good sign. That is not a good sign. That means he's no longer ventilating appropriately. His CO2 has climbed to a dangerous level. So his brain is no longer telling him to breathe. And his heart rate has dropped because his oxygen is dangerously low. And in fact, after we intubated him, I think his PCO2 about 30 minutes later was 95. So if you had a PCO2 of 95, you would die. A normal is like 40. Mm-hmm. Okay. So meaning we did a blood gas on him. So you don't need to worry about any of that. But the point is that, I was exposed to this. He had the flu. We treated him. Guess how long it took him to come off the ventilator? 3 days. That was it. The average length of stay on a ventilator with SARS-CoV-2 is 22 days. That has a lot of repercussions, right? When you put someone on a ventilator within 4 hours, some studies have shown that your diaphragm, your major breathing muscle, starts to atrophy. So what do you think is happening by day 22?
I can't imagine you'd be able to breathe when they take you off of it.
Well, we wouldn't take you off, right? So there's this whole testing process that we go through to see if people are going to successfully come off the ventilator. And they are coming off the ventilator. But now what we're seeing is when I intubate someone with the flu and they get better, they go home. Unless they develop severe scarring, because they've developed ARDS from the flu, or they already have existing lung disease, typically they don't have permanent lung damage. And more importantly, they don't have all of the other sequelae, all of the other consequences. So if someone gets really sick in the ICU, we will often see their blood pressure will drop. They'll go into what we call shock. That can result in irritation of the kidneys. So their kidney function will go off. Sometimes that's permanent. It's rare that that can happen, but it can happen. But what we're seeing with SARS-CoV-2 is months after someone has come out of an ICU, they have critical illness, neuromyopathy, which is fairly common in anybody who's in the ICU for a long time. That's not unique to SARS-CoV-2, but it is unique to any disease that you're in the ICU for a long time. Again, that's not what the flu does, right? The flu does not typically give you a critical illness neuromyopathy because you haven't been in the ICU as long. Okay, what does that mean? It means months of rehab. Okay, it means some people can't walk when they get out because they're so weak, right? So another thing that we're seeing is people will just develop these waxing and waning symptoms. So, you know, a month later, they go through this bout of fevers, cough, chills, they test negative, they still are having brain fog, they're still having symptoms of this. So SARS-CoV-2 is not acting in a way that is easily explainable. And it's likely going to take a couple years for us to truly understand the mechanisms by which it is doing these things. Another thing that's pretty unique about it is if someone has the flu, they feel pretty crappy the entire time, right? If you talk to people who get COVID-19, they'll tell you, yeah, it's really weird. I felt great for like 3 hours. And then all of a sudden it was back and I had the fevers and the chills and the cough and I just felt like I was going to die and I was super tired and fatigued. And then 6 hours later, they feel great again. So that's not a typical response for something like the flu. So that's another way that it's different from the flu. So the whole reason I brought that up was really to focus on complications. So unlike the flu, we are seeing this really weird thing where people are developing what we call a post-COVID syndrome. If someone has ARDS, we do expect them to have some degree of damage long-term. I typically do not assess their lungs until the 4 to 6 month mark because it takes that long for them to settle out. So like we talked about before, if you have traditional ARDS, there's something called the 1/3 rule. The 1/3 rule is 1/3 of people's scarring and inflammation gets slightly better. The scarring never gets better, but the inflammation goes away and their lung function improves. 1/3 stay the same and 1/3 continue to deteriorate. What we know about ARDS is that the 28-day mortality is better than the 1 year. In other words, the 1 year mortality is higher than the 28-day. So the reason that's concerning is just because you make it out of the ICU by day 28, it doesn't mean you're out of the woods. Because more people are going to die until they get to that 1 year mark. Okay. Yeah. So, and again, remember the reason I'm talking about ARDS is we're seeing a lot of ARDS more than we do with the flu with SARS-CoV-2. Okay. We talked about age groups a little bit. We talked about racial groups. Black, Indigenous, and people of color are being hit hard. There are a wide variety of reasons for this. So some of them are most Black, Indigenous, and people of color are low-income workers that are front-facing. So they're transit workers, they're environmental service workers, they're cashiers, they're in low-paying jobs with no hazard pay, no real protections. You know, some of this wouldn't be an issue if there, for example, been an actual mandate for us to wear masks, right? Because then there would actually be the ability to go, hey, I need to call the police or public safety or somebody because someone's not wearing a mask, right? And we don't have that ability right now. And it really shouldn't be on a grocery store cashier to make sure someone else wears a mask, right? Yeah. So that's one of the reasons. But another reason is pollution inequity. So if you look nationally at pollution and respiratory diseases, when the SARS epidemic hit in China, or in China and other parts of East Asia, the people that lived in high pollution areas had twice the mortality as the people who didn't live in high pollution areas. When you look at SARS-CoV-2, what we're currently dealing with in Italy, same thing, mortality was significantly higher in areas of high pollution. When you look in America, we have something called pollution inequity, which is that if you look at across sort of the racial spectrum, if you look at Black people, for example, they are responsible for causing X amount of pollution in the air, right? but they are also responsible for being exposed, or sorry, they're not responsible for, they're exposed to far more pollution than they actually cause. Same thing with Hispanic, Latinx people as well. Okay, so they also produce less, they're responsible for less pollution than they're exposed to. Caucasians, 17% lower rates of pollution than they cause. They cause far more pollution than they are exposed to. So again, the high pollution areas, disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and people of color, okay? Then you add to that things like 82% of Black people don't have the ability to work from home, right? Which is a safety measure. Yeah. You add to that the idea that years and years and years, decades of systemic racism has resulted in housing insecurity, crowded housing, substandard housing, right? You look at urban areas versus rural areas versus suburbia, the vast majority of Black, Indigenous, and people of color tend to live in urban areas, which are more crowded than rural areas, right? Or suburbia. I just I'm so sorry about this. I just want to make sure that this is not, okay, no, it is not the ICU. Okay.
So no one's coding right now.
Say that again?
No one's coding right now.
No. Well, no. So I'm on call for donors.
Sure.
So they're already dead.
Okay. Oh, okay.
I'm on
so the
call
outlook
to
is not good.
Brain dead donors
Okay.
whose families have agreed to donate their organs, but they're usually very unstable, and so that's what I was dealing with the other day when I had to keep getting off the phone because we had a really unstable donor. So that's sort of where we are as far as what's new with SARS-CoV-2. What's new with treatments? So it's been 6 months, so I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about hydroxychloroquine. Okay, so people are still obsessing about this drug. And the crazy thing is, the very first trial that everyone was basing, oh, we should all be using hydroxychloroquine, was just a crappy trial. There's no other word for it. The main problem with the trial is it was a very small trial. There was like 20, 25 people in the treatment arm, okay? So they had people what they basically did is they did a retrospective look at who got it and who didn't get it. And then what they did is they took people out of the treatment arm that did worse. They said they were lost to follow-up. So 6 people were taken out of the treatment wing, right? So they should have been like 25, 30 people in there. There were less than that in there. One of them just refused to be in the trial anymore. Another one, I can't remember. I think that guy genuinely they lost to follow-up. 3 of them ended up in an ICU, meaning their disease got worse and they ended up in an ICU, and 1 died. So if you give someone a drug in a trial, if you give 100 people a drug in a trial, 50 of them get worse, but you go, you know what? I'm just not going to analyze those 50 people. And I'm only going to look at the 50 people that didn't get worse. You can prove benefit to anything, right?
How do we know
it's not realistic. It's not real.
How do we know then the drug helped them get better? It could have been that they naturally fought it off and the hydroxychloroquine.
Well, no. What I'm saying is, my point is, if you take people out of an analysis in a treatment arm who are getting worse, you are playing with the numbers, right?
Right.
You're taking out the bad stuff.
Yeah.
You're taking out the people that got worse despite treatment to say, oh no, treatment works, right?
Yeah.
The latest hydroxychloroquine trial, okay, the one from Henry Ford, that unfortunately, one of the sort of more famous lifestyle medicine doctors is hanging his hat on. It's shockingly bad. Okay, and I say it's shockingly bad because it was done by Henry Ford. Henry Ford is an outstanding hospital. This was a retrospective review. Henry Ford is doing a prospective randomized trial. That data is going to be important when that comes out. There are so many problems with this retrospective review. For example, so what they did is they basically randomized people retrospectively. So they did a chart review of people who had SARS-CoV-2, and then they randomized people who got hydroxychloroquine and people who didn't, and then they looked at how they did. Okay, so retrospective, not as strong as a prospective trial, right? But one of the major problems is if you look at the 2 groups, the control group, meaning the group that did not get hydroxychloroquine, and the group that did, there are major differences between the 2. For example, there were more men in the control group. Men tend to do worse, okay? But the most important thing is that the majority of people in the treatment arm got dexamethasone. We know dexamethasone works. There was an excellent study that showed that dexamethasone works. So if you have a bunch of people in a trial that are getting dexamethasone and your treatment drug, and the other group, people aren't getting either, you cannot say that the treatment worked, because it could have just been the dexamethasone that made it work, right? And that is what we suspect. So right now, there is zero evidence that hydroxychloroquine works. Then people said, oh, well, no, but that was a hospital thing. There's, if we give it before they get really sick, then it'll be great. No, there have been great, really well-designed studies that looked at people who had very mild disease. There was no benefit. So when you hear people say stuff like, I've given it to 200 of my patients and they did great. Well, they were all going to do great anyway. You did it as an outpatient. There was never any evidence that they were going to get any worse. But what you have done is increased risk that they have a bad outcome, right? Every medication that we give to somebody increases risk of a bad outcome, right? There's always a side effect to them, right? So that's really what it's about. In medicine, we always look at risk versus benefit. So convalescent plasma, this is something that we were really hoping was going to pan out, which is where you take antibodies from people who've already had COVID, you purify them so that, people can't react to them. And then you give them to people who are quite sick, because maybe they just need extra antibodies because they're not able to boost their own antibodies. The latest trial, unfortunately, shows no benefit to convalescent plasma. Okay. So again, another reason we shouldn't be listening to politicians, we should be following scientific data.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, could there be another trial down the stretch that shows benefit? Sure. This trial was well designed. They picked people that were moderately ill. They did not pick people that were super ill. The problem with picking someone that is super ill is, are they going to die anyway or are they going to have a bad outcome anyway because they're so sick at that point it's too late for them to get treatment, right? So you kind of want to pick people that are in that sweet spot. And sometimes that's hard to predict, but they picked, the study was very well designed. They had really good data to show that it just didn't work. If other data shows that it does, then we need to think about it. That brings me to remdesivir. So remdesivir is an antiviral drug that was originally created to fight Ebola. Didn't really have great response with Ebola, but we started doing clinical trials for it here because it inhibits part of the same replication pathway that it does for Ebola. So when we look at these drugs, there always has to be a mechanism of action that makes sense, right? So with remdesivir, it's that part of the replication process it can inhibit, right? So we have a little bit of conflicting data with remdesivir. So the SIMPLE trial came out that maybe showed a little bit of benefit, but not a lot of benefit. Then the ACT-1 trial came out. That was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. I happen to know one of the PIs for that study, Dr. Anish Mehta. He's the chief of infectious diseases at Emory. I have known him for over a decade. He was a couple years below me in residency. This is a guy that I always tell people, when I was the fellow in the ICU helping to train him, I was trying to convince him not to do infectious diseases and to do pulmonary critical care because he's just that smart and that kind and that compassionate. And it's probably a great thing that he did not listen to me and went ahead and did ID, because now he's doing amazing things. So the reason I bring this guy up is because I trust this guy. Like, I trust him to know what he's doing. He's one of the transplant infectious disease doctors at Emory. So I know the quality of work that he does. So the ACT-1 trial actually showed some benefit. It didn't show like dramatically huge benefit. It's not a cure. What it showed was that it lessened the course, meaning the time course of the disease. So it shortened the course and it helped people get better a little bit quicker, and it sort of lessened the severity of the disease. What's interesting is the Solidarity trial has just put out data. Now, they've put it out on that website that is not peer-reviewed yet. That said, very respectable infectious disease doctors have looked at the trial, looked at the data, so it's sort of unofficially been peer-reviewed. And it is interesting because it showed no benefit. The interesting thing about the Solidarity trial is it was a huge trial. So the ACT trial was a multi-center trial, okay? But the Solidarity trial is on a whole other level. It's like 30 countries, like hundreds of hospitals, like thousands of patients. The problem is the way that the trial had to necessarily be designed is there is a lot of variety between the groups and what they were getting. So that's always a little concern. So for example, if it's a hospital in Vietnam and they don't have access to convalescent plasma or remdesivir or sorry, not remdesivir, a particular antibiotic or a particular vent care or something like that, it's harder to say that all the groups were equal. In a perfect trial, you want the control group and the treatment wing to be as similar as possible so that you can say the results are not because of differences in the groups. Yeah. Okay, so that's one of the problems with the trial. The other problem with the trial is when it started out very early in the pandemic. And early in the pandemic, people were not going to the hospital. So by the time they showed up to the hospital, they were very, 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 very sick. There's a theory, and again, this is just a theory. We do not have scientific evidence to prove this, but if I'm trying to put together, how did one really well-designed trial show benefit, and how did another really well-designed trial not show benefit? This is a theory that might explain it. So we know that when it comes to SARS-CoV-2, there are a couple different phases that we're looking at. The first part of the disease is really the viral infection replication phase, right? But then the problem arises when the immune system kind of goes nuts, right? So the immune system stops just doing a regular job of fighting off everything. It starts to really just kind of attack everything willy-nilly, right? So that's where the inflammation comes in, the damage comes in, all of this other stuff. So it's possible that a larger proportion of the patients in the Solidarity trial were in that second phase, where it's not so much viral replication driving the disease, but inflammation. So in other words, if someone has inflammation and you give them an antiviral, is that going to help? No. Right. If someone is having a lot of viral replication and you give them a drug that inhibits viral replication, then it will work. And in the ACT 1 trial, the vast majority of patients, or not, I shouldn't say the vast majority, it was like 25% of patients, which is a decent chunk, all had only had symptoms for a minimum of 6 days. So the analogy that to kind of, because that's a lot of words and a lot of terminology that may be confusing to people. When you think about the flu, I think we all know if you get the flu, you have to go to the doctor within 48 hours for Tamiflu to take effect, right? This is very similar. It may be that the answer is not, does remdesivir work, yes or no? The answer may be, maybe. Maybe it works in people with mild disease who we catch it very early. Mild to moderate disease, I should say, because they were on oxygen. They were not on ventilators. So again, it's all about finding that sweet spot where they're not so sick that the drug isn't going to do anything and that we're in a different phase of the disease process, but they're not so mild that they would have gotten better without it anyway. The side effect profile for remdesivir is not horrible. When we talk about things like drug side effects, a lot of people, particularly in the vegan community, kind of freak out when they look at the inserts, right, for any kind of drug. Right. The reality is you have to list all that stuff legally. That doesn't mean that that's a very common thing. So as an example, if you were to, on its face, look at remdesivir, you'd be like, 36% of people got anemic with it. What the hell? That's really bad. But in the trial, when they were looking at side effects, in the placebo group, the people that didn't get it, like 38% of people got anemic, right? So you can't just look at a percentage for remdesivir. You have to compare it to the other people who are sick as shit in the ICU anyway, and are, going to get anemic and have kidney failure and heart problems and things like that. One of the things that I forgot to mention when we were talking about long-term sequelae. One of the things that we're seeing with SARS-CoV-2 is myocarditis, so inflammation of the heart. So and any virus can do this. The problem is we're seeing it in really young people, right? So a really young person may not have a ton of symptoms, but a month later they may come in going, I feel really short of breath, doc. And then they get sent to the lung doctor, and then they get sent to the heart doctor, and then eventually we realize, oh, you have heart failure. you have an inflamed heart. And the problem is that we don't know, is this myocarditis going to resolve on its own, which can happen, or is it going to continue to stay the same? Is it going to get worse? We just don't know. So that's another way that this is different, I think, than the flu. What are some other options? So interferon is another option. Interferon is an immunomodulator. So that's a really fancy way of saying that you are modifying the immune system to stop hyperreacting to things, right? That's how dexamethasone works. We're trying to calm down the inflammation. Steroids are basically like an anti-IL-2. IL-2 is an inflammatory cytokine. So interferon, I think you and I talked about this in the first update, maybe. We talked about how a lot of people were going, well, Cuba has interferon 2B. Why don't we have that? Well, again, it's never been FDA approved here. And it's possible that it will work. And there are trials ongoing globally for that. And so this is just another thing that we have to wait for the trials, because unlike something like remdesivir, there are some serious side effects to giving people interferon. As an example, we used to give people interferon to try to calm down inflammation in people that had scarring lung disease and were waiting for lung transplants. What we noticed was that not only was it not helping them pre-transplant, it might have actually been making it harder for them to do well post-transplant. So you can't just give people immunomodulators and be like, oh, great, no problem. There's some very, very serious risks to that, including death. Okay. Monoclonal antibodies are another option. So part of the physiology, part of the way that SARS-CoV-2 works. Remember, we talked about how there's this cytokine storm. There's this vigilant immune system, this sort of overreaction. One of the inflammatory molecules that is upregulated, meaning there's a massive release of it, is something called interleukin-6, IL-6. And there are antibodies that exist against it. When we say things like monoclonal antibody, what that means is we are taking antibody produced against IL-6 from one particular population of B cells, not general antibody from all of the B cells. The B cells are the ones that make the antibody. So we use this drug in a lot of people with things like rheumatoid arthritis and other rheumatologic diseases. There are trials right now, and anecdotally, there does seem to be promise with monoclonal antibodies. If you recall, Trump got 2 monoclonal antibodies, right, as part of his treatment, right, from Regeneron, I think. So I can't remember what those 2 antibodies were against. I don't even think they mentioned it in their release, but presumably it's monoclonal antibody against IL-6 and something else.
And where do those come from? Is it, if he got an antibody, does that mean it came from a donor, came from plasma, or?
So for Regeneron, the original antibodies were produced using the fetuses of the embryos from aborted fetuses. Uh-huh. So what they basically do is they stimulate the cells to produce antibodies. So in the same way that you can inject a flu vaccine into someone so that their B cells start to recognize what you've just injected and then produce antibody against those components, you can do the same thing using things like embryos and stuff like that, which the only reason I bring that up is it's just very weird to me that a bunch of pro-lifers don't seem to have a problem with the fact that he got Regeneron. I mean, I don't have a problem with him getting it because those embryos would not have been used anyway, but right. It just is a little bit unusual to me that people who are against the use of embryos in medical research haven't really seemed to comment on that.
Yeah.
So, that brings me to the other thing that I wanted to mention is, does Trump's illness make sense? And honestly, it really does not. It's very clear that they did not give us the whole story. And here's the simple reason why. So first of all, the idea that his oxygen level dipped twice to 93, and that created mass panic and oxygen and flights to Walter Reed doesn't make sense. Now, I can understand he's the president. the idea is that because this disease can just suddenly go from you're coasting along, you're sick, but you're not horrible, to suddenly, you're on a ventilator. I can absolutely understand why they would want to get him to Walter Reed quickly. That's not the problem. The problem is, unless they're saying he had massive coughing fits twice, and that's why his oxygen levels dropped. It's just weird that his oxygen level would drop, come back, drop, right? Like, that story doesn't make sense to me. So it suggests that he was probably hypoxic for a little bit longer. Number one. Number two, he was given drugs that we know you should not give to people with mild disease, right? So dexamethasone is a drug that, if you actually notice in a talk that I gave for climate healers, I actually say steroids are not indicated in SARS-CoV-2. And the reason is, initially, we didn't think it was indicated. And this was based on our knowledge that for standard ARDS, if you give people steroids, they get worse. Okay? Of course, SARS-CoV-2 is doing something different, and we have now proven that if people need oxygen and they're on a ventilator, dexamethasone really does seem to help, i.e. steroids really seems to help, okay? So, but what we also know about SARS-CoV-2 is if you give it to people in mild disease, they get worse. So if I'm a Walter Reed doctor and somebody, I don't care who they are, I don't care if they're a VIP or not a VIP, and someone comes in with mild disease, would I give them a drug that is known to make people with mild disease worse?
Of course.
I would not do that, right? So clearly, there's just very clearly nothing fits this picture, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't give someone remdesivir and monoclonal. I mean, the indication for remdesivir includes hypoxia. It doesn't include 2 tiny dips of hypoxia. It includes sustained hypoxia requiring oxygen.
And how do we
Right.
know, do we, like the public, know what Trump had done, or like what kind of treatment?
He admitted it. I mean, the White House told us that he got these things.
Yeah, okay.
What they didn't do is, when people were asking, wait, hang on, he got dexamethasone, he got this, so what did his CT show? What did this show? What did that show? They clearly didn't show us what that, any of that. Now, obviously, I cannot, because I've never examined him, I've not seen his images. But having watched people be hypoxic and exert themselves for most of my career, there's no way he didn't have significant lung damage, right? Or lung involvement, I should say, right? That whole stupid scene where he runs up the steps or walks up the steps and then tears his mask off, he's clearly out of breath, right? He's using his sternocleidomastoids, which means he's using secondary muscles of respiration, right? I mean, he's in what we would consider at minimum moderate respiratory distress.
Yeah.
Right? He's like, he's basically trying to increase airflow because he's short of breath, right? So people need to understand that him getting discharged from the hospital in 3 days is meaningless because he got discharged from one hospital to another hospital, right? There is a hospital in the White House. So that's the whole thing with Trump. And again, like, this has nothing to do with politics. This is just medically, nothing that happened made sense.
Yeah.
Do
you have
antibodies?
Do you have
sorry, go ahead.
a theory? Like, not to ask you to speculate, but like, do you have an idea what might explain what we saw in him?
I think he was sick for longer than he admitted.
Yeah.
And I think he had more extensive disease than he admitted to. And we won't know because he refused to release his CT images.
Okay.
Right? Which, in someone like Trump, you would expect that if his CT images looked awesome, he'd be like, I have the best CT images ever. No one has CT images as awesome as me, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing that he would say.
Doctors were
right?
amazed. They said they'd never seen CT images this perfect.
Right. I was waiting for him to be like, oh, they did a head CT on me, and unlike Sleepy Joe Biden, I have no dementia. And the doctors just were, they said that I had the brain of a 20-year-old, and they wanted me to autograph it. Like, that's what I would have expected if all of that were true.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, like, I definitely understand wanting to be private. I just don't think you get to be president of the United States and with a life-threatening disease and be like, I'm not going to share that information with you.
When you're politicizing that disease and now you're also falsifying information about it as it's manifesting in your own body, which is giving people more reason, and then literally using that as a platform to tell them, don't live in fear. Yeah, it's really stupid. It's really reckless.
Well, that actually, so one of the things I wanted to address is, what would I say to someone who says this is all fear-mongering and that not all doctors agree?
Yeah.
So there's two things that I would say. So I do pulmonary critical care. I've done things like scrubbed into the OR and had my hands in someone's chest as we were doing a transplant. I'm not a surgeon, but I would often scrub in on the interesting cases just because it was cool, and nobody else really had an opportunity to do that. And I've had a pulmonary artery rupture in my face, just get a face full of blood, have to have my mask changed, crash a patient on ECMO. I've had people who, I have run codes, which means the person's gone into cardiac arrest and I'm running in there and they are literally dead. And unless I can fix the problem, they are going to stay dead. I have run 2 codes simultaneously because I was the only one on call, and 2 rooms coded at the same time.
Oh my God.
Okay. I'm not saying this to be like, look how awesome I am. I'm saying this to be like, nothing I have described is incredibly unusual in the medical community.
Yeah.
Okay. That's my landline. I'm just going to ignore it because
okay.
it's probably, it's going to be like a telemarketer.
You know it's a telemarketer. I had someone call me today from a 212 area code. So I'm like, oh, well, this could be like a local, that could be important. It's just another telemarketer. I am that sucker who I will answer. I will go out on a first and second date with a telemarketer. Just thanks for just thinking of me. Hey, as long as we're paused, I just wanted to take a moment. I copied the link again in the chat, but I just wanted to remind people that we are doing this as a partly just to have the conversation and get the information out there, but we are also hoping to use this opportunity to raise money for Sweet Bear Rescue Farm. So whether you're watching it now live on Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern, well, that sounds so official the way I said that, or if you are watching this after the fact, you can still donate to Sweet Bear Rescue Farm. So using that link, bigfatveganradio.com/donate link. Also, as long as that link I just have up there temporarily, but I wonder, Lisa, could you tell us, is there another link that people could donate to directly?
Or do you have like a GoFundMe?
Yeah, actually, first I just want to say that was incredible. Thank you.
Oh, there's more.
Oh, there's more. There's a lot more.
Oh, I believe it. I have about 35 kids that live outside that I need to tend to in a few minutes.
Sure.
But, man, your last 10 minutes, I am going to encourage everyone to listen to this because it has been so politicized and it's such a dangerous proposition, and it's honestly shameful. So thank you for your honesty and for speaking in a way that we all understand. I'm like blown away by how incredible this has been. Okay, so back to the animals on the farm. My overarching nonprofit is called Kindness Empire because in addition to the work that I do with non-human animals, I also have quite a few like home insecure initiatives, global relief initiatives. So at paypal.me, the / is Kindness Empire, all one word. Venmo is Kindness Empire. And then our Facebook, Sweet Bear Rescue, has a donate button. We're also on Amazon Smile under Kindness Empire, Patreon under Sweet Bear. It's a little funny because there's like a DBA and the overarching nonprofit, but Patreon is Sweet Bear Rescue, and then there is a Sweet Bear Rescue wish list on Amazon as well. But the two most important would be paypal.me is Kindness Empire, and Venmo is Kindness Empire. Thank you so much. Like I said, I have to go take care of the kids, but I loved every second of this. This was awesome. I hope you and I get to share a stage again at some point. And Ben /Honey is the MC because This is a human that I just absolutely adore. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. God, I would love that. Absolutely. I'm also going to change, if I can, I'm going to change the donate link. So bigfatveganradio.com/donate link. I'm going to redirect that. So instead, it just goes to your paypal.me. That way, if people are watching this in the future, it'll just go right there, and I don't have to remember to move that money into the side.
Just when I think I can't love you anymore, you say something
Listen,
like that.
My biggest fear when I do stuff like this, oh, damn it. Oh my God. You know, right before we started this chat, I was like, okay, I'm going to be 5 minutes late. And if you're wondering what I was doing, I was grinding steel bars. I'm putting up some shelving and,
This is your remodel.
yeah, this is more of the same. I was putting up some. If anyone knows the Container Store, they have the Alpha shelving system, and I am like its biggest fan. But I'm putting up a like a bedroom wardrobe closet, and the bars that everything hangs on were literally like a quarter-inch too long to fit without me having to like take a crowbar and pull up the baseboards, which I didn't want to have to do. So for me, it's like, do I pull up the baseboards to get them out of the way, or do I just grind about an inch off of each steel bar? So like literally minutes before we're doing this, I'm like, I should hop in a shower. No, first I'm just going to quickly, and even with the right tools, sawing through steel is not the easiest thing. But
Right.
as I'm doing it, I could not find my goggles, and I'm like, well, I'll just do.
What are you doing?
There are bits. There
Says
are
the
bits of
doctor,
metal.
Ben.
There are bits of metal flying everywhere. I did have my goggles on, but as and not only bits of metal, but they aren't shooting off as bits of metal. They're shooting off as flaming red sparks. Can you imagine how cool this looks to my neighbors? I'm doing it all right in front of the window. But then before we started, I was just like, I should hop in a shower before we start, because I am probably covered in metal shards. And as I was adjusting on the couch just now, I put my hand down and I felt one tiny metal shard went into my finger. But I think I got them all for the most part. But I'm sharing all
Who
of that.
doesn't have a metal shard in their finger during this conversation?
At some point, and you know what? It's how I know I'm alive. Well, anyway, I'm gonna update that link so that automatically reroutes to their PayPal, and then I'm gonna send over all of the donations that came in so far during leading up to this today.
Thank you both so much. And I cannot wait to see your rehab when it's completed.
Oh my God! It's
Maybe
gonna
it'll be in person if the world ever goes back to normal.
You
Yes.
got a place to stay in New York City if traveling is ever again a
Same,
thing.
friend. Always
Yes.
have a home here.
Awesome. Oh, thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Lisa.
Okay, bye all. I wish I could stay for the rest, but the masses,
worries.
they need to be fed.
Yeah.
They get angry. Okay, bye.
Okay, so I've just updated that link, so that should now be redirecting people. If you go to that link, it should now redirect them to, and I'm just gonna type it in myself just to make sure it works. So /donate link, yes, it now goes to Kindness Empire, and this is why it's better to use your own short links on WordPress than to use a link shortener like Bitly, because then I can always change them. Anyway, oh no, I'm noticing, Joni, I'm just seeing your message right now. Apparently, it was telling people 4 o'clock was when the event would stream live. It's funny, when I chose the time, I chose 5 p.m., but it gave me 2 time zones for New York. One was -4 and one was -5. I should know better. We are in the -5 time zone. I don't know why I let it select the default, which was -4, but oh well. So if anyone was wondering why we started late. But so that said, let's go back to our talk. So you were talking about
Okay.
Trump's illness. And
Well,
you gave
I was
your
talking
theory.
about how would I answer if someone said, you're just fear mongering.
Yeah.
So then I gave this whole long, unnecessarily dramatic story of some of the things that I have experienced, right? And the reason I bring that up is that's not unusual for a critical care doctor, right? I mean, you'll meet ER doctors who are who have to deal with trauma, right? Like, I have a friend who's an ER doctor who calls me up one day and he goes, I just had the craziest shift. He was working at a non-trauma center and some guy just walks in with his hand in a bag full of blood and ice. And the guy was cleaning his gun and shot his hand. And for unclear reasons, he shows up to a non-trauma hospital and the guy's like, I can do nothing for you here, but call 911 and get you to a trauma center. And despite that, he was calm, he did everything. So the reason I bring this stuff up is, it is not my experience that critical care doctors, that surgeons, that ER doctors, and infectious disease doctors panic easily, right? We don't fear things and try to get people to do things through fear, because as physicians, we understand you cannot lead people to do things through fear, right? You can only incentivize people to do things, right? Infectious disease doctors lived through the HIV epidemic when there were no treatments available. And they had no idea how the virus worked. They didn't understand why initially it was only gay men. They didn't understand the mechanism of action, let alone that there were any treatments for it. These were not people who were panicking, right? Tony Fauci is not a guy who freaks out when stuff like this happens. So when we talk about you need to wear a mask and you need to do things, we are not panicking. So you might hear my brother because he's just come home from work and he and I share a house right now. So you might hear him before he takes the dog out.
Okay.
Hang on. Sorry about that.
Sure, no problem.
So that would be my response to, well, are we fear mongering, right? I mean, again, we're not the type to do that. I'm not sure what that would accomplish. As a physician, it doesn't help me in any way. There's no incentive to me making people fearful, right? There's no incentive to me going, yes, we shouldn't allow people to eat indoors right now because it's, higher risk. That I don't hate restaurant workers. I mean, there's just no incentive for us to do those things. And so it's a really weird suggestion that doctors and scientists would lie about that, because what would be our motivation to do that? Yeah. Right? So the idea that all doctors don't agree. I mean, so first of all, there is an art to medicine. So some doctors will disagree about things like who should get remdesivir, right? Should we put this guy on a ventilator? Should we continue doing high flow, right? But the vast majority of physicians that are following the science and the evidence are agreeing. It's really important that when you look at things like this guy, Scott Atlas, wasn't that his name? The neuroradiologist that Trump is using as his go-to person, which, by the way, just notice for a minute that he decided that the response for Americans was a neuroradiologist, right? But his doctors weren't neuroradiologists, right? He had actual internal medicine, pulmonary, infectious disease doctors, right? So another thing that's really important to understand is medicine is super specialized now, right? So having a neuroradiologist talk about infectious diseases is like me telling you how to rebuild an engine. Right? This is not my area of expertise. A neuroradiologist is an expert at radiology for the brain and the spine. Yeah. Okay. Now, he may still remember some stuff from general radiology. So he's the guy you call if you want him to read an X-ray or if you want him to read a brain MRI. He's not the guy you call to figure out how to respond to a viral pandemic. He's not the guy who understands immunology, who understands epidemiology. So this whole nonsense of herd immunity that they have come up with. Yeah. When people like Dr. Carlos Del Rio, who is one of the most brilliant infectious disease doctors in the world, okay, he's the guy that is in the room that world leaders are calling upon when it comes to figuring out pandemic responses. When someone like Anish Mehta, and more importantly than those, you don't have to believe that the doctors that I trust are worthy of trust, right? The Infectious Diseases Society of America, which is the national organization, and in reality, it's an international organization, right? When they are saying herd immunity is not a good idea, when the American Thoracic Society, which again, it says American in it, but it's really a worldwide organization, when they are saying herd immunity is not a good idea, right? These are the people that you want to follow. So if you are concerned that this particular doctor has a political bent and that's why they're saying what they are. I mean, the reality is I take care of people every day who do not believe what I believe, right? And if I, as a doctor, am not able to leave my politics at the door and take care of a patient to the best of my ability, I shouldn't be a doctor, period. Right? And that is how most doctors are. But if you don't feel like you can believe a particular doctor over another one, like if you for some reason think that all of a sudden this is the hill that Fauci has decided to die on, right? Yeah. He's worked with 6 different presidents, both Republican and Democratic, but this is the hill he's decided to die on. Look at the national organizations. Look at the Infectious Diseases Society of America, the Society for Critical Care Medicine, the American Thoracic Society, the American College of Chest Physicians, the European Respiratory Society, right? Look at these organizations that are made up of physicians of all political bents. And if they are saying something, that's who you should believe. Yeah. Not the random doctor who loves Fox News or the random doctor who loves MSNBC, right? Because let's face it, MSNBC has an incredibly, I'm not a fan of MSNBC because they are excessively liberal, right? So, and they also have a very clear agenda. So this is not about, again, this is not about politics. This is simply about science. So that's that whole rant. There were just a couple other things that you and I had talked about that I wanted to address. So myths about masks and carbon dioxide and oxygen.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up on that? When you were talking about herd immunity, so can you explain to me, like, and I'm sure from the term, I think I can get what it means. And I feel like most people are probably going on that sort of a definition. Like, yeah, it probably means. Could you tell us just briefly what herd immunity is and, like, specifically why that is not a thing and, like, why that's not our best option?
Well, it is our best option if our herd immunity is coming through vaccination, right? So herd immunity is when the vast majority of the population is immune to the virus and therefore it cannot spread, right? So for example, there are people who are always going to be at risk of disease, right? They're immunocompromised or a solid organ transplant recipient. They are neutropenic because they're getting chemo right now, so their blood counts are really down, things like that. So they can't necessarily risk getting sick, right? Their protection is that everybody else has developed immunity to a disease, and therefore the disease isn't ping-ponging back and forth amongst the population. So there's a couple ways that can be achieved. Technically, you can achieve herd immunity if everybody gets sick. The problem with that scenario is that it would require hundreds of thousands of people to die, right? Because they're not going to be immune to it. And not just die, the people that survive, like, a lot of times my patients will go, you know what, like when I'm talking to them about going plant-based, they'll go, you know what, doc, I don't care. If I have a heart attack and die, I have a heart attack and die. And I'm like, I'm not worried about you having a heart attack and dying. I'm worried about you surviving a massive heart attack, surviving a massive stroke, right? Yeah. I'm worried that you're going to have heart failure for the rest of your life. Yeah. And then now you're yet another one of my patients that's severely depressed because their quality of life is in the toilet, right? I'm worried that you're going to have a massive stroke and you're not going to be able to walk and feed yourself and clean yourself and understand what people are saying to you, right? So death is not the worst thing that can happen to us, right? And please do not misunderstand me. I am not in any way trivializing the people that have lost family and loved ones and friends. That is not my intention when I say that. My point is, death is not the only thing that we have to worry about. We have to worry about permanent disability. Yeah. And herd immunity through getting sick this is what would happen. Now, we do achieve herd immunity every year with vaccination for the flu, right? If we can get a large proportion of people to be vaccinated. And the way that we determine how many people need to get vaccinated is dependent on how infectious the disease is and how effective the vaccine is. So most people do not believe the vaccine is going to have more than somewhere between 40 and 60% efficacy, right? In other words, 40 to 60% of people who get the shot will develop immunity to it, right? And immunity doesn't necessarily mean you can't get it. It could just mean, like the flu, you'll get a milder course that's far less dangerous.
I think people really misunderstand that.
Right.
I don't think people get that point.
The problem is that if you have something that has 40 to 60% immunity, it's likely that 80 to 95% of people would need to get vaccinated in order to achieve herd immunity.
Yeah.
And right now, because vaccines have become so politicized, there's mistrust. And I understand the mistrust. Like, I will be honest with you, if a politician told me the vaccine is ready, I'd be like, no thanks. Right?
Yeah.
If Tony Fauci, if Anish Mehta, if Carlos Del Rio said, no, vaccine's good, you should get a vaccine, you're a lung doctor, I'd be like, sign me up.
Yeah.
Right? If scientists tell me, and the reason I say that is we know that this administration has just crushed the reputation of the CDC. They've done, they from day one, they've interfered. Like, they removed transgender and diversity and all these other concepts and pages from the websites, right? They have politicized the FDA. They've put pressure on the FDA to do things. So this is why we're seeing nonsense like the CDC saying, oh, it's airborne. Nope, it's not airborne. Oh, it's airborne. No, it's not airborne.
Yeah.
It is airborne. We know now, we didn't know this initially, that there is a decent number of people that are getting it through airborne spread. The difference between airborne spread and droplet spread is very simple. Droplet spread refers to you cough, you sneeze, whatever. You have a droplet, say your mucus, your spit, whatever, sputum, and in that droplet, it's chock full of virus. So the reason I'm bringing this up is it's important to understand when people say things like the virus is only 2 microns and the filter and your mask can't filter 2 microns. It doesn't need to filter 2 microns. It needs to filter a droplet, which is larger than that and has 1,000 virus pieces in there, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's that misunderstanding.
The virus isn't just like self-propelling its way and wiggling through paper or fabric.
It's kind of like if you put a bunch of people in those giant hamster balls.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's sort of how to think about it. It's not one virus in a hamster ball. It's like 30, and the hamster ball is big enough that it's going to get trapped.
Yeah.
So that's one. So the droplets are heavier. They're bigger, so they're heavier. And because they're heavier, they don't travel as far a distance. The exception to that is if you're breathing really hard because you're exercising, you cough, it's more, you're propelling with more force. But the general rule is about 6 feet for droplets, right? Airborne is different. Airborne precautions are aerosol particles are smaller particles, and because they're smaller, they're going to sit in the air longer. They're going to be able to travel farther with wind and mild breezes and things like that. So the reason it's important to know that is, and we definitely know that there has to be some component of airborne spread. How do we know that? Because of events like there was some cases in China where 2 families were sitting like on polar opposite ends of the restaurant. I mean, like, more than 20 feet away from each other.
Yeah.
One guy was sick in one party and the entire other party got sick and nobody else in the restaurant was sick. How did that happen? Air conditioning spreading aerosol particles. This is why indoor eating is more risky than outdoor eating.
I have central air in my building. Is it possible that the air being filtered through?
I mean, it's very much less likely in like a building scenario. I'll be honest, I don't know the data on that. I will look that up and get back to you.
But I mean, that's what filters are for in the...
Right. But the reality is the likelihood that someone in 2B is coughing and you're, say, in 12B are going to get it is fairly small because unless you just have an incredibly powerful central air conditioning system, they could propel droplets that far. Yeah. That's unlikely, right? But in an open air system, in other words, droplets can't make a 90-degree turn in a duct, right? But in an open area, they can spread and be propelled through, air conditioning and things like that. So that's an important concept. And I bring that up because when it comes to masks, I don't know where this came from, this idea that, we shouldn't wear masks. Actually, I do know, because unfortunately, Woogans have decided to spread, it's sort of this idea of a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. So they'll look at a study and they do not have the training to interpret that study correctly. And they'll go, see, that study showed that their CO2s went up when they wore a mask. Okay, so here's the truth. If you wear an N95 and you run for 30 minutes, your CO2 will absolutely go up. And here's why. When you wear a mask of any kind, you are increasing airways resistance. You have to subtly breathe a little bit harder to get oxygen in. Mm-hmm. Some people notice that more because they panic a little bit when the mask goes on, right? Some of that is psychological because already they're panicking and thinking, now I'm not going to get oxygen and things like that, right? If someone has to wear a mask for like 8 hours, they'll definitely notice it. Okay, but there is a difference between statistical significance and clinical significance. So something can be statistically significant, like your PCO2 might go up from 40 to 45. I promise you, clinically, you are not going to feel, you might have a little bit of a headache, but you're not going to have a headache in 30 minutes. Yeah. In the hour that you're at the grocery store, in the 2 hours that you're at the mall running around running errands, right? That's not necessarily going to happen. When people talk about CO2s going up, the way that physiologically would happen is we breathe in oxygen, the oxygen diffuses from our air sacs into our bloodstream. Our blood takes that to our organs, drops it off, picks up carbon dioxide, we exhale that carbon dioxide. Okay, carbon dioxide is a byproduct of our body metabolizing things. Okay. So you can imagine if you have a barrier, it is just the tiniest little bit harder to breathe out and to breathe in. So again, all of that response is exaggerated if you are exercising. Okay. However, who's running in a grocery store? Like no one's wearing a mask and then going to the grocery store and jogging. What was that?
Are they about to close?
Okay, maybe. But I mean, in theory, people aren't on average running to Trader Joe's with a mask on and then going, let me take the opportunity to go for a run. Well, right?
and I do go running in a mask. And I mean, I'm not someone who's got, compromised lungs or anything, but like I've done interval training, running.
Well, some people do it on purpose, right?
Yeah.
Some people wear masks on purpose while training to increase airways resistance so that they can maximize their lung strength.
Oh, interesting.
So they've actually done studies. They did a study in Jacksonville recently. It was a very small study. They basically took people with moderately severe or severe COPD, right? So these guys do not have great lung capacity, mm-hmm. and just regular residents, right, who volunteered. And they made them wear masks, and then they made them do stuff for 30 minutes, like walk around and exercise, and then they got blood gases on them. And in 30 minutes, no effect. No change in oxygen, no change in carbon dioxide, okay? Mm-hmm. So we know from multiple studies that while, for example, an N95 can cause more of an issue to somebody than a surgical mask will, because again, the point of an N95 is that you have a really good seal on it, mm-hmm. right? Because you're wearing that for things like TB and things like that. Yeah. But the reality is that you are not going to have a significant increase. The longest I've ever worn a surgical mask was like 8.5 hours. Basically because I scrubbed into the surgery that we were talking about and the guy's PA ruptured and it took forever for us to get it done. But I will routinely, like there have been days where I'm trying to put a central line in someone and you've got to be sterile, so you're wearing a surgical mask. And the person's a renal patient and I just can't get the line because they've clotted off all their veins. And so like I'm doing this side of the neck and nope, there's nothing there. Then I'm doing this side of the neck. But in the meantime, I got to wait for the chest x-ray to come. And it's too much of a hassle for me to break sterility. So I'm still in the mask because the minute I touch the mask, I'm no longer sterile, right? And I don't want to take my gloves and gown and cap back off because that's more of a pain in the ass than just sitting there waiting like this for the chest x-ray guy to come, right? And then I'm trying in the groin and things like that. So there have been times that I'm wearing it for 3 hours, no problem. The longest I've ever worn an N95 was 6 to 7 hours. And that was because one of the hospitals I trained at has an actual TB wing. So that entire wing is only for TB patients or patients we suspect have TB. And each room is under what we call negative pressure, right? So instead of blowing stuff in, stuff is sucked out of the room, right? Well, negative pressure went down that day, which meant I had to wear the mask not only in each individual patient room, in the hallway, in the conference room. So my day started at 5 a.m. I came in, I did like 6 LPs in people that had cryptomeningitis. Then I wrote my notes on everybody on that floor. Then we started rounds in the conference room. I was wearing the mask the entire time. Then I ran around and did more stuff. And then I was finally able to take a lunch break like 8 hours later, right? It was a little bit annoying. Some people did complain of headaches, but again, what scenario is the average person wearing an N95 for 8 hours?
You're going to get a headache from the rubber band or from the elastic
Yeah.
before anything else. Also, I'm just realizing now, doctors must have a wonderful tolerance for like my face itches in this one spot, but oh well.
Oh, no.
No. Oh, really?
The minute I put my mask on,
Yeah.
I'm like, dang, my nose itches.
Well,
The minute I get sterile is
You
when
must
everything,
be
like,
so well-
nurses get really, really good at, like, you know, like, we just don't have personal space, right? So
Yeah.
if I don't have a nurse in the room with me, I will sometimes holler for a nurse to come in. She'll be like, is everything okay? I'm like, yeah, can you scratch my nose?
I love it.
Yeah, so, like, the minute I get sterile is when everything starts to itch.
Yeah.
So that's the thing with masks. What about getting infected from the mask? Because there was some weird thing going around that was like, oh, it was that woman. Like, there's like some weird meme about some girl who claims that her daughter got pleurisy, and it was because she was wearing the mask and blah blah blah. I'm like, first of all, that is a complete misunderstanding of what pleurisy is.
Mm-hmm.
The pleura are the lining of our lungs. Okay, they're very important. They suck out fluid and they release fluid into the pleural space, so they do have an important job. Pleurisy just means inflammation of it. It doesn't necessarily mean infection of it, right? There is no way that you can get pleurisy from wearing a mask. And the reason for that is simple distance and physics. The way that you get pleurisy is someone gets a pneumonia. So the air sacs of the lung get infected. There's pus in there and then it spreads. If you think of the lungs, the anatomy of the lung, think of it like an inverted tree. Okay? So here's the tree trunk, branches,
Yeah.
and then finally the leaves are the air sac. Now imagine an incredibly thin, 1 cell layer thick lining that covers each leaf individually. Okay, that's the pleura. So now imagine at the bottom of the tree trunk, you wrap the bottom of the tree trunk, right? That's the equivalent of wearing a mask.
Yeah.
How in the hell could anything at the bottom of the tree trunk affect the leaf at the tip top of the tree? It could not. However, let's say there's some sort of tree parasite and you put it right on a branch, on one of the smallest branches leading to the leaves.
Okay.
That can cause damage to the leaves. And because the cell, the pleura, is that thin layer coating it,
Yeah.
then the pleura can get infected, right? You cannot get pleurisy from wearing a mask.
Well, it just seems like
The other thing sorry, go ahead.
The trunk, the base of the tree is just so far removed from the pleura, from the covering of the leaf, that like by the time it reached the leaf, the tree would have like filtered it. The tree would have like, the impact of that would have been so dispersed.
Right. So you'll sometimes hear these weird anecdotes like, I knew a guy who wore a mask and he developed a pneumothorax. That's a collapsed lung. Okay. Theoretically, that could happen, and here's how it would happen. The person already has structural lung disease, so they have like a bleb, they've been a smoker, or they're like a super tall, thin person, and so their lungs just have these weird little areas where they don't have completely normal tissue, and it's just like a big bubble, and that can pop for any reason whatsoever. But the person puts on a mask, they start to panic a little bit, they start to breathe a little bit fast, and then they suck in very hard. They're generating huge amounts of negative pressure in their chest. Theoretically, that could cause that blood to tear and pop. Okay, it's not because they wore the mask, it's because they did this. Like they could, if they did that without wearing the mask, they could have a pneumothorax.
Yeah.
Right? It has nothing to do with the mask. The other thing that's really important to understand is you cannot get an infection from the mask unless you already have an infection in your mouth.
Yeah.
Oral flora, the bacteria in our mouth, are not what we call pathogenic. They do not cause disease. unless you have an abscess in your mouth. Then absolutely, a frequent cause of, there's like a particular thing called Klebsiella pneumonia. Okay, so the standard thing that you learn in medical school is an alcoholic is found passed out on the street and they have a Klebsiella pneumonia. What is the most important part of the physical exam other than the lungs? Well, it's a good oral exam, because it's entirely possible they have an abscess, they passed out, the abscess drained pus down into their lung, and that pus had Klebsiella in it, and that's how they got the Klebsiella pneumonia, right? So the only reason I bring up this stuff in excruciating detail, and I apologize if it's completely boring your viewers, is I feel like if we don't give people clear explanations and understanding, then this is how this bizarre stuff gets propagated, right? I mean, I will admit it can be a little frustrating to have to say this stuff, because there's a part of me that's just in the back of my head screaming, I'm a lung doctor, can't you just trust me? You know what I mean? But I understand, particularly I think within the vegan community, there's this really unfair extrapolation that because doctors don't know anything about nutrition, they don't know anything about anything.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, if that is the case, then I wasted 27 years of my life. Right? So, because I didn't just, yes, you're right. I mean, that is a fact. I didn't learn about nutrition, but I learned how to put in chest tubes. I learned how to do tracheostomies. I learned how to do bronchoscopies, how to run a code, how to administer drugs, which drugs need to be renally dosed if someone goes into renal failure, what's the first line drug to give if someone's in shock, how to look at a blood smear under a microscope. What does it mean if someone has anemia and their MCV is high? What do I need to order? How do I interpret TSH and thyroid stuff, right? I mean, there's 1,000 things that I could mention that I know how to do. And again, this is not like Dr. Naik is so amazing. No, this is like a standard thing that doctors know how to do, right? So my point is, I can see why there's already this like level of mistrust within the vegan community for doctors, because every person I know has had that experience where someone goes, you're telling me you're tired, maybe it's because you're vegan, right?
Yeah.
So I can understand why there's a mistrust, but again, if it's not pertaining to veganism, you kind of should trust the oncologist when he tells you about cancer.
Right.
Right? You should trust the respiratory doctor when they talk to you about respiratory disease, right? I mean, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with getting a second opinion. I do second opinions for my colleagues. I have patients request a second opinion. A big red flag to me is if you ask for a second opinion, you ask your doctor to refer you to somebody else for a second opinion and they take offense.
Oh,
there should be no ego in medicine.
Yeah.
So if your doctor takes offense, that is definitely a red flag to me.
Yeah.
Right? I never take offense. If someone wants a second opinion, great. And you know what? If the other doctor disagrees with me, that's fine. If it gets the patient what they need, then that's all that matters. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes I will disagree with something. I might be more conservative about giving someone steroids than one of my partners might be, right? That's a more style thing than it is a knowledge thing, right? So second opinions are not a problem, but this sort of mass mistrust of science is, I mean, that's why we are where we are, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, so there's this idea that, well, the reason that we have so many cases is because we're testing. No, that's not what testing just gives you knowledge that's already there. Right. So the analogy that I use is, if someone has a brain tumor and you don't scan their head, it doesn't mean the brain tumor doesn't exist. It just means you don't know about the brain tumor.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the whole advantage of doing rapid in-home testing, which is what a lot of doctors are calling for, is if you test and it's rapid and you know about it, then you can isolate very quickly and you prevent the spread, right? This whole, it takes a week to come back, it takes 3 days to come back is a problem.
Yeah.
The reason that the Trump super spreader event was a problem was not that because they do rapid testing at the White House. The problem is half the people that showed up were tested that one time. And we know very early when someone is a carrier and they don't show symptoms, they can still test negative.
Yeah.
So for example, if you've been around someone who has COVID, right, they tested positive and they have COVID, and you get tested that day and it's negative, you should still get tested a few days later, because the first test might be negative.
Yeah.
Right? So it's one of those things that testing is not the problem. Testing is just information. right? Doing the test doesn't spread the disease. It just tells you who has it so that we can isolate the people that need to be isolated.
Yeah.
So rapid testing is actually important. This is in part why South Korea has such a low level of cases compared to the United States, right? Because they were doing 50,000 tests a day at one point. It took us 6 weeks to do 50,000 tests, right? And the reason that happened is they did the test, they found out he was positive, they locked it down very quickly. Speaking of lockdown, everybody in America is like, we've already locked down and it hasn't worked and now the economy sucks. We have never locked down. We have never truly fundamentally locked down. It's not politically expedient. And I get that it's super easy for me to say that as a physician with privilege and not a small business owner. But the reality is an 8-week shutdown, complete and total shutdown is what we ideally need. Now, initially, when we talked about wearing masks and not wearing masks, and why did Fauci say we didn't need to wear masks initially, and now he's saying we do? There's like 3 major reasons for that. The first is we could not get masks for healthcare workers. So asking the public to start hoarding masks like they were toilet paper was endangering everybody.
Yeah.
Right? Because if your doctors and nurses die, that is the problem, right? That's when the economy collapses because there's nobody to take care of you then, right? So that was number one. The other reason is I think all of us were naive about the concept of lockdown. All of us were really ignoring the fact that we have built a government system that means that there is a large chunk of the population, low income, people of color, who cannot lock down. Because we have built a system where they have to go work at the grocery store. They have to work in the pharmacy. They have to, we decided that meat packing plants were essential. Right? These are people who had these were like ground zeros for outbreaks. And we're going, nope, America needs to eat their flesh. Right? So this is a problem. So we did not anticipate that. We as physicians were a little bit naive about how racist the system is. We knew the system was racist, but we didn't realize how racist the system was. So that was the other issue. And then the third issue is, yes, we initially didn't have incredibly good evidence to suggest that in the context of a mask shortage, that masks were going to work excessively well, especially because our goal was to shut down, right? So it's kind of like saying, all right, you've cut your finger open, I've got suture or I've got Steri-Strip. Well, which one are you going to choose, right? Well, if you think you can get away with Steri-Strips, that's better, right? It doesn't hurt the patient. You don't have to numb them. You don't have to worry about taking the sutures out, right? We did not realize that no one was going to Steri-Strip, right? That people were not going to lock down. That was the ideal. If we'd all stayed in our houses for 2 to 3 weeks, this wouldn't be a problem. We'd see what we saw in Australia. Yes, are there going to be pockets because there's going to be that breakthrough? Sure. Yeah. But it wouldn't be like it is now. Right. So this is the fundamental issue. And, now the administration is saying stuff like, well, it is what it is, and we're just all going to get sick. And it's like, well, yeah, I think, what was it? The chief of staff said, we can't control the pandemic. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. You can't, because you won't do anything that we need to control the pandemic, right? So again, this is not a partisan thing. If Obama had said, we can't control the pandemic, I would have the same response to it. Yeah. If Biden said it, I would have the same response to it. Science does not give a shit about your political views. The virus does not care if you're a Democrat, an independent, a liberal, or a progressive. All it cares about is, do you have the ACE2 receptor in your nasal mucosa? And yes, you do. Right? So this whole idea that, we shouldn't do this and we shouldn't be afraid of this virus and all these things, I'm like, well, we should be a little bit concerned about it. I'm not saying run around fearful, but if doctors who do really scary things on a daily basis are telling you that this is a concern, you should probably believe that it's a concern. All right, so we talked about lockdown doesn't work, 5G. So I think you had asked me about that jokingly at our part 2. And I think my response at the time was, I plan to spend exactly 0 amount of time researching it.
Thank you.
And here's the thing. I will admit I haven't really researched it yet, and here's why I don't need to. The idea that 5G could be causing this. So again, when we talk about science, we have a hypothesis, and then we test out the hypothesis. And depending on what that shows, we either accept the null hypothesis or we don't accept the null hypothesis, right? The null hypothesis is that 5G is spreading this disease. How do you explain the hundreds of countries that do not have 5G that still got infected?
Mm-hmm. Like Iceland, for example, was, I believe, one of like the test countries for 5G. They're like, we have 5G everywhere, and they had 10 cases.
Right. So the opposite is also true, right?
Yeah.
So how do you explain the countries that don't have 5G that are having outbreaks?
Yeah.
And how do you explain the countries that
Not
do
10
have 5G
not 10 cases. I
and don't
misspoke.
have outbreaks?
I misspoke. They had 10 deaths. And I should say this is with the population of like 340,000. So the number of cases that they had ultimately was in the thousands or so.
Well, but the population amount wouldn't necessarily matter. If you're saying an external source like 5G
Yeah.
is somehow making a population more susceptible,
Right.
that would be the case regardless of the population number.
Right.
Right?
And I would
So
say even proportionately, Iceland had a lot fewer cases, proportionally as well. But in a
Right.
place where they have more 5G than anywhere else. And wasn't
Right.
South Korea another one of the 5G?
Well, but you don't have to look at that. You know, I mean, there are countries right now that are having bad outbreaks that don't have 5G.
Right.
So how are they spreading it, right?
Right.
The other thing to think about is this whole like, well, you know, Sweden didn't lock down and they did fine. No, they didn't. You can't compare Sweden to us. You have to compare Sweden to other countries like them. And they did terribly when they tried herd immunity, and now they've backed off of it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, they were like, well, our citizens are responsible. And believe it or not, their citizens were relatively responsible. They were certainly more responsible than we have been about going out and things like that. But they have the highest per capita rate in that entire region of disease cases. So you can't be like, Sweden did an awesome job. I mean, compared to us, sure. But that's like saying, Sweden doesn't have as many gun deaths as we do. Well, yeah, but it's a different system,
Yeah.
right? So I think I've beaten that pretty well. We talked about mutations. I think you had some questions about mutations.
Yeah.
There are a couple regions that are a little bit concerning. So like I've read about an area of Chile that is having an unexpectedly high number of cases. So we think there might be a mutation in the works. I mean, this is always something we've worried about, right? On some level, SARS-CoV-2 must have had some sort of mutation in the sense that initially dogs and cats couldn't get it. Now they can. It's rare. It's not happening often, but it is happening. I mean, the job of a virus is to mutate, right? That's how we got it. It was in animals, it mutated, and it spilled over to us. So there's always a possibility that it can mutate. And that is one of the concerns, because if it mutates, this is no longer a one and done vaccine, or like you get a vaccine, like for Hep B, you got to get 3 shots, right? And then for life, you're pretty much immune, unless you lose the immunity because you get older or something like that. But that's because hepatitis B is a relatively stable virus. It doesn't mutate frequently, right? Yeah. HIV mutates frequently, right? So similarly, it's possible that that SARS-CoV-2 will be one of those. That is a concern that we have. So we've been going for a while. I did just want to bring up some concerns that I have about vegan celebrities just spreading absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
Okay? So the person that I am personally offended by is Will Tuttle. Okay?
Doctor.
Whatever.
Dr.
I mean, the dude has a
Tuttle.
PhD, and my mother had a PhD, and I respect that. He has a PhD in education. So I don't necessarily give a shit what his opinion is about medical stuff, unless he goes to medical school and residency.
There you go.
In an appropriate field. Okay? So the concern that I have is when he says stuff and he is spreading this, I mean, he's spreading Russian propaganda websites, right? Saying things like, this Danish doctor proved that masks cause problems, and he couldn't get it published in any reputable journal. What does it mean? It means it failed peer review. That's what it means. Right? Or he never submitted it, right? Yeah. If you submit something to the New England Journal of Medicine and it doesn't get in, it doesn't mean the New England Journal of Medicine is wrong. It means there's something wrong with your study.
This is like,
as someone
can you imagine the radio? They won't play my song.
Right? I mean, so it's like, I mean, so when I have submitted research papers, I generally have gotten them published, partly because I sort of knew which caliber to publish it in, because I sort of had an idea of what caliber the study was. But there's always a proportion of people who, like, you submit the thing, reviewers look at it, they come back at you with like 100 flaws that they find in the article. And you either have to do more experimentation, collect more data, or you have to explain why that's not appropriate. Or unfortunately, there's always that one reviewer that you're like, you know, he asks a question and you're like, you mean the thing I've already addressed right here in this section that you clearly didn't read? You know what I mean? So there is a peer review process. So because something didn't get published in a reputable journal doesn't mean the reputable journal is trying to hide information. It's that it does not meet their standards. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that is it, right? So that's a concern that I have. But the larger concern I have is, frankly, what he is spreading is extreme white privilege and possibly white supremacy. Mm-hmm. And here's what I mean by that. He spreads shit like, you just need to eat well and get fresh air and grow your own vegetables and exercise and you'll be fine and you don't need to worry about the virus. Well, that's great, Will, because you live in Northern California in a nice house on land and you can grow your own veggies. Can the average Black, Indigenous, or person of color who's a low-income worker do any of that? Do they live in an area that's not affected by pollution? Do they have disease? Like, the whole idea that plant-based diets are going to cure you of everything is really offensive to me, because if you have a high ACE score, which is an adverse childhood experience score, right, you are more likely to have obesity, cancer, heart disease. Okay? If you live in an area of pollution, you are more likely to have type 2 diabetes and die of lung cancer or heart disease. Pollution dramatically affects mortality through real pathways. Okay? So if you live in a polluted area, don't get me wrong, obviously eating a plant-based diet is going to protect you as much as it can, but it completely ignores the reality and it erases the reality that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are experiencing. And I take great offense at that. And that's what I mean by this whole idea of white privilege. And at what point do you want to call it white supremacy? I don't know. At what point is the fact that a white man who comes from clearly some privilege and a degree of comfort that the average person doesn't have, right? At what point is him peddling this nonsense white supremacy? I mean, I don't know the answer to that. It is definitely extreme white privilege.
Well, it's a good point. I mean, whether, you know, between white supremacy and white privilege, what it's definitely in practice is white prioritizing. Like, right. You know, it's like with for any non-vegans listening, they might not know about this, that like, the FDA, the food pyramid that we recommend for all Americans, well, that works best for white people. White people can tolerate lactose more than, and I forget which order they go in, but like Latino and Black and Asian, like in diminishing abilities to process lactose. Asian people can process it less than most others, which is why you don't see like cheese in, you know, like Chinese food, for example. So, you know, that's an example of something that it's set up for white people, like as if we're the default, and it's fine that it works for us and it might not work for other people as well, because, hey, as long as we're okay. So that's an example of what I would term white prioritizing or white priority, which definitely is in the vein of white supremacy.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it would be one thing if he was saying you need to do these things because it will reduce your risk of a poorer outcome. Okay? Let me be very clear. Eating fruits, vegetables, and grains and avoiding animal products in no way prevents the virus from binding to the ACE2 receptor. Mm-hmm. Okay? I mean, it's basic science, okay? Don't get me wrong. Obviously, eating a plant-based diet promotes better health and better immunity, right? You don't have as much inflammation in your body, which is hugely important, right? Your blood vessels are functioning better because you have more circulating nitric oxide synthase, so you have more circulating nitric oxide. You don't have inflammatory molecules like TMAO and CRP and all of these things. So I get that all of that is true. What is not true is that magically, if you eat a whole foods plant-based diet, you are not going to get sick.
Yeah.
Because that physiologically, that's just not a possibility, right? Now, what the importance of a plant-based diet during a pandemic is it prevents the next pandemic from happening, right? Given that we know that 75% of pandemics occur because of our use of animals, not just factory farming, but also things like, the wildlife trade and, like Ebola exists because of our use of animals, and HIV exists because we sort of invaded the jungles to get more bushmeat and things like that. So this is not a Chinese issue, right? H1N1 started in a farm in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is a human non-vegan issue, right? This is not a Chinese issue.
Right.
So that's point number one. Point number two is the reason to go plant-based isn't just to prevent the next pandemic from happening. It does decrease your chance of a worse outcome if you get sick, because you are more likely to not have high blood pressure, to not have heart disease, to not have type 2 diabetes. It doesn't mean that you are guaranteed you won't have those things, because there are other factors at play, like pollution, food apartheid, right? I mean, there are other things that are at play when it comes to these things. If you're ever interested in learning about adverse childhood experiences, you should watch a movie called Resilience. It talks about how there are many people who, there's a clear link between abuse and neglect and other adverse childhood experiences and obesity rates, right? So we know that obesity is not just a bunch of people who eat all day and don't exercise, right? I mean, it's a much more complex thing than that, which is why there's a whole field for,
Can you give me the name
called
of that
obesity
again?
medicine.
I want to pop that name in the chat just so it appears here.
It's called Resilience.
And is it a documentary or a film?
It's a documentary about how we even discovered this whole idea of adverse childhood events.
And it's about, just so I can type it correctly, it's about
Adverse childhood experiences.
adverse childhood experiences affecting our health. Okay, good.
And then the other, so, we've sort of talked about Will Tuttle as much as I can stomach talking about Will Tuttle. Right. The other person that just concerns me, and I swear I'm not doing this to be controversial or to be, calling out people or anything like that. This guy has way more followers than I will ever have, because I just don't care about those things. I just want the message to get out there and for people to stop hurting animals. Mm-hmm. But Joel Kahn is pushing the hydroxychloroquine study, the Henry Ford study. And as we've already talked about, it's a crap study. If you want more information about why it's a crap study, VGN News did an article that quoted me. And the only reason I bring that up is if you click the link, it'll link you to my Facebook post that went into excruciating detail of like the 10 reasons why it's a crap study. So it's very important, in my opinion, that people stay in their own lanes, okay?
Yeah.
In the same way that I can sort of look at a study and analyze it and kind of come up with ideas about a neurological issue. At the end of the day, I am not a neurologist. So if an academically trained neurologist is like, no, you don't know what you're talking about, then that's a discussion that we need to have, right? So unfortunately, in the lifestyle medicine world, we have all these doctors now talking about things like, how will a plant-based diet protect you from COVID? And the answer is, it won't. Mm-hmm. What it can protect you from, again, as I've said, till I'm blue in the face, is a worse outcome. Okay? But again, because of things like ACEs and pollution and systemic racism, which has real, tangible, physical effects on our bodies, it is not the same thing. And what frustrates me is the lifestyle medicine doctors that are saying all this are all universally white.
I just found the a link to the VGN article as well. I'm going to go ahead and include that here.
So the only reason I bring that up is if you click, I think at some point it quotes me and then it says, like, there's a link so that you can read the whole thing if you want to go to, it's a great way to fall asleep. If you're struggling to sleep and you have insomnia, read that post and you will immediately fall asleep.
And for anyone who's currently watching, I apologize. I tried to look that up in the background and it somehow disabled the chat, so I'm getting the chat back up here.
So we have been going for a while. I actually do have time. If anybody has questions, have any questions come up?
Let's see. So I don't have any questions here in the chat just yet. Oh, did I accidentally? Sorry, I'm moving the chat window here.
And should Joni get some sort of prize for sticking with us this long?
Oh my God! Well, yeah, Joni, she was the first one in because she thought it was here for. She thought it was starting at 4. Well, I think what Joni can certainly get as a prize is she can be the first one to ask a question. I definitely think that's a good start. I'm just repositioning the chat. Sorry about the disruption there with that. So that is there now. And I'm going to paste the link there.
Joni, did you have a question?
There we go. Joni, do you have a question? If so, you can go ahead
need to unmute.
and unmute, and then we can take your question live.
Okay. How's that?
Great.
That's better.
Okay. I talked about this briefly with Ben before. Can you just speak to the asymptomatic issue? I keep hearing that that's the people shouldn't worry about it because we've probably all had it and just been asymptomatic, and it's, I don't have any basis for this, but I'm guessing that's a very small very small slice of the.
That's very unlikely to be true. That's very unlikely to be true, simply because of the infectivity and the comorbidities in America and the percentages that we're seeing of people who are having mild symptoms. Now, is it possible? So, for example, a family member of mine called me one day and he's like, I don't know what's going on. I have a stomach ache and I have a little bit of diarrhea. And I was like, I'll admit I was a little bit eager and I was like, you probably have food poisoning because you're eating meat. This person is not vegan. And they were like, no, that's not it. I've been eating the same things I always eat. And then fast forward a couple months like a month, and his job, for whatever reason, decides to offer antibody testing. And he was positive. He was weakly positive. But now we were kind of going, hang on, did you just have a GI version of COVID-19 and we just didn't realize it because it was right at the start of the pandemic, meaning after it had hit our shores. So we just didn't know. And this person works in healthcare, so they could have had an exposure. The problem with being asymptomatic is whether you have symptoms or not. I mean, yes, of course that's important because if you have symptoms and you could get worse and you could get really sick. But the larger issue is that a significant portion of people who are asymptomatic are spreading it. You can still spread it when you're asymptomatic. That's the problem, right? And the other problem is, again, unlike the flu, it's pretty rare for someone to have the flu and not have symptoms, right? Maybe they'll have it for like 4 hours and not have symptoms, right? But we're seeing people who won't have symptoms for like a week, 10 days. Right? And in 10 days, you can do a lot of inadvertent damage by spreading it when you're asymptomatic. Because again, this isn't about you coughing, just speaking. People have dropped, like I had this orchestra teacher who was wonderful when I was in middle school or elementary school, right? But when he made me first violin, I was just like, oh, I really don't want to be first violin. And I didn't want to be first violin because the guy just sprayed everybody in the first row when he talked, right? Just a brilliant teacher, but like you just needed to wear a poncho right, when you were playing. And so if you're first and second violin, you're in the first row, right? So, I mean, that's a funny story, but if that guy had COVID
Right.
and he was asymptomatic, that would be a disaster, right? So to me, the larger issue with asymptomatic, first of all, we know that not everybody has it, because if everybody had it, our numbers would be higher, right? Like when we're testing people, we wouldn't just see a couple million people. I forget what the last number is of people that are testing positive. There are 300 million people in America, right? So even if you say only 50% of people have been tested or 40% of people have been tested, you would still expect between 130 million to 150 million cases, right? If that's how many people were being tested. You know, the challenge to me with being asymptomatic is this idea, it kind of goes to this whole idea of, well, we're going to check your temperature before you come in. I'm like, and that does what? Because if I'm asymptomatic, I'm going to be afebrile. I'm not going to have a fever. It doesn't mean I can't spread it to anybody. You know, I mean,
So
sure, if you have a fever, then you definitely should go home, because that means you have symptoms, which means your viral load is probably higher, which means that your burden in every droplet is likely higher. So you're probably going to spread it more. And also, why the hell are you out with the fever in any event? Right. So there's a reason. So I get that, but people are going, oh, if you don't have a fever, it's fine. Come in. And I'm like, all you've proven is you don't have active disease. You haven't proven that you don't have it.
If someone is asymptomatic and test positive, how likely are they to actually get sick? I think that's what I've been hearing. Another myth that sometimes, you know, oh, so what if you have it? You're not going to get sick.
No,
doesn't make
no. So it totally depends. So initially, like I remember saying, you know what, if I get it, I'm going to have a mild case. I'm pretty young. You know, it's not going to be a big deal. And then again, as I said earlier, the morbidity mortality weekly report that came out, and since then we've had subsequent studies that have confirmed this, the people that are ending up in the hospital, the vast majority of them are young people. They're under the age of 64. So the things that are concerning for us are if you test positive and you are heavyset, you are somebody who has heart disease, lung disease, you are immunocompromised because you're a cancer patient, or you're getting active chemo, you're an older person. These are all risk factors. So the more of those risk factors you have, the more likely you are to get sick. But the challenging thing with this virus is it is very hard to predict who gets sick, right? Because why are young, healthy people dying? Right? So there's something about, there's fundamentally issues with the mechanism of action that we have not completely mapped out, that if we are ever able to do, maybe then we can figure out who's getting sick and who's not. So for example, there's a computer modeling study that suggests it might have something to do with bradykinin. And sure, maybe that is what makes, so bradykinin is basically a molecule that is in our lungs. And I won't bore you with all the details, but maybe at some point we'll realize that what we really need to be doing is if someone tests positive, the next test is a bradykinin test, right? I mean, that's not really a thing, that's not really ready for prime time. But until we really can elucidate how this is, like completely map out from start to finish why it's doing this. Like why do people have brain fog? Right? Is it crossing the blood-brain barrier? Is this all vascular damage and then lack of blood flow to the brain? Again, because of this whole concept of happy hypoxia, are people walking around with low levels of oxygen and they don't realize it? And so they're taking these like micro hits to their brain, which can cause long-term problems. I mean, it's speculation at this point.
Scary.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question, Joni?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, this has been so much wonderful information. I have to
I mean, I'm impressed you haven't fallen asleep.
Well, I'm very worried about, the behavior of people around me and not taking it seriously and pushing it off. I don't need to wear a mask. It's, so what if I get it? I just get the flu for a couple of days and then I'll be fine. There's just all this misinformation that I hear on a daily basis, which is kind of making me crazy. In fact, I wrote down what you said about science doesn't give a shit what you think. That's
Yeah,
my
I
new
mean,
mantra.
you know,
And that's
one of
what I've
the-
been saying.
So one of the things I point out to people who are saying, oh, well, if I get it, it's going to be mild. That may be the case. Maybe you're healthy. Maybe you'll be like my friend Richard, who I did an Instagram live with, and it's on his Instagram. It's at Richard Lima 1. This guy, like when I say healthy, this guy is literally a vegan model and ultra athlete. And he got sick, and he got fairly sick, not horribly sick, but he got sick enough that he did not feel like going to the gym. He didn't feel like doing anything, right? He was coughing a lot, yada, yada, yada. Can I guarantee that 6 months from now, and I don't mean to pick on him or sort of put bad juju out there about him, but can I guarantee that 6 months from now, he's not going to have brain fog? He's not going to have myocarditis? Again, we don't know the pathophysiology, so no, I can't guarantee any of that. So why would you want to get a disease when we could just be a little bit more careful and wait for the vaccine, which is coming?
I know. I don't get it.
So what I would say
I
for
have
you
a lot
is,
of- excuse me,
sorry,
I
go
have
ahead.
good- I don't get it either, but I have a lot of good ammunition now.
So one of the things I suggest to people who are struggling with family members is remember that stress actually reduces, suppresses your immune system. So stressing about things, I mean, I don't mean to be like sort of, hippy dippy or whatever, but we do, again, for me, it's about science, and we know that stress suppresses the immune system. We know that negative thinking and worrying about these things causes real tangible effects in us, right? So when we are stressed out, we sort of trigger fight or flight mechanisms, right? So our sympathetic nervous system goes up. But in an effort to do that, our body has to shut off other systems or make those less of a priority. And that includes things like your immune system, right? So living in a state of constant stress is not good for you. So what I would say is just do what you can do, right? Focus on what you can do. So if your family, sorry, that's my dog who's super excited that he's getting food now. But if, for example, if you have family members that just won't wear a mask around you, feel free to be like, you know what, don't come around.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wear a make sure you're wearing a mask when you go out. If someone this is such a stupid story, but my alarm system went off for some unclear reason. There was no reason for my house alarm to go off. So I called the cops because I'm like, I'm not walking around my house I was the only one home. And they showed up to the door and they were not going to wear masks. And I was like, do you want to put a mask on? And they were like, do you want me to? And I was like, I mean, I'm an ICU doctor. It's up to you, but I'm more of a risk to you than you are to me. So you tell me what you want to do. And they ran out to their cars and got masks, right? But you have the right, I mean, of course, you have the right to say, well, you do what you want to do, but I need to do what I need to do.
Yeah.
And again, remember, the mask is not the only thing, right? So everyone is like making the mask the hill to die on. The mask is part of an armamentarium of things we need to be doing. So we need to be masking. We need to be physically distancing. I don't love the term socially distancing because we are seeing a rise in depression, and I personally am seeing a rise in more suicides as cause of death for the donors that I am dealing with than I've ever seen before. And I know it's related to the pandemic. So, doing Zoom chats and things like that, we want to do that. Staying physically distanced, we want to do that. And again, remember, nothing replaces hand hygiene. Right. So if someone the reason to wear a mask is, and I wear glasses. And so I always wear my glasses with my mask because your eyes are another theoretical point of entry. Mm-hmm. So if you go out and you're someone who wears contacts and you're going to the grocery store, maybe put on glasses instead and wear your mask. If someone coughs on you, the barrier is what's protecting you, right? But when you get home, make sure you wash your hands, right? So everyone is freaking out about hand sanitizer and stuff. I can't really use hand sanitizer. I'm actually allergic to most hand sanitizers. It causes me to cough. There's some chemical in it that just causes me to have bronchospasm. So I've always relied on hand washing at work when I'm taking care of patients with the flu and, other things. So, you want to wash your hands for 20 seconds. Washyourlyrics.com is a great thing. You can put in any song that you like. So we always say, sing the happy birthday song twice. If you don't want to sing that, I think I put in You Give Love a Bad Name by Bon Jovi, just because I wanted to see what would happen, right? And so it'll pull up a poster of how to wash your hands, and it'll actually tell you when to switch over. So like for these 4 words, you're doing this, and then you switch over to this and things like that. And it'll show you exactly how to wash your hands. And that is the key, right? Another thing that's really important is, like, I'll see people wear gloves at the store, and that's fine if you want to do it, but I feel like it lulls people into a false sense of security, because they'll put on gloves and then they'll touch a milk carton and then they'll touch their face. And Ben had the perfect description that I use for everybody now. Think of it like glitter, right? Think of everything like glitter. So if your hand is clean and you've put a glove on in the car, and then you touch the grocery store cart, maybe the grocery store cart is clean because people are doing such a phenomenal job of making sure that they're wiping them down. But then you touch that plant milk carton, right? I hope it's a plant milk carton. And then you go, well, I don't really want this one. Oh, this is the sweetened kind, and I want unsweetened. And you put it back. Your glove is now dirty, right? So then if you decide to adjust your mask, you've now touched your face. So I personally don't wear gloves when I'm in a store, mostly because I just don't want to deal with, getting them and throwing them away. I mean, I wear gloves enough, right? So I just don't wear them. I just make sure when I touch stuff, I don't touch my face, right? When I get into the car, I take my mask off from here, right? I personally reuse my mask because it's fine. I wear 2 different masks because the minute I put a mask on, I start sweating. And if the mask gets wet, if it's a surgical mask, you lose the integrity of the mask. So I wear a cloth mask and then I wear the surgical mask on top of it. That's just my choice. You don't have to do that. I take them both off. I hang them up in the car because I'm not really going out that much. So by the time I go out next, it's going to be fine. But then I do, even though my face is super itchy and I'm sweaty and all I want to do is wipe my face, I do not do that. If I am desperate, I will take my shirt.
I've done that
right?
too. Yep.
Don't
You
do
have to
the
remember
outside.
which part of your shirt
you don't know
use,
what's on
though.
the outside. Do the inside.
Oh, good tip.
But you have to
Right?
also memorize which part you use, because sometimes I'll use the bottom of my shirt to grab something or open a door.
Yeah.
And then later I'm like, which side? Okay, so this is the wiping my face side. The bottom is the grabbing a door handle side.
External stuff, use the external part of your clothing. Stuff on you, use the internal part of your
Good
clothing.
thinking. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So and then, in the house, especially if you live in a multi-person house, make sure that you are wiping things down periodically because everyone is using them. And unless everyone is housebound, they're all potentially bringing stuff back, right? So, the handles of your fridge, your microwave, your doorknobs, people forget about doorknobs, the light switches. I have a tendency to turn everything on with my elbow, but I don't remember to do that every single time. So I periodically go through and I wipe everything down. The faucets. Now, my brother is a pharmacist, and so we're both kind of germaphobes. And since we share a house, we've literally laid out a plan, you will only touch the top part of the fridge. I will touch the bottom part of the fridge, right? You will only touch, because you don't need to use hot water when you wash your hands. The soap is the important thing. So he only touches the hot water faucet and I only touch the cold water faucet, right? If for some reason I do touch the hot water faucet, I make sure I wipe the faucet down and then I wash my hands, So, there are just little things like that you can do. And I don't know if that's paranoid or not, but it seems logical to me to make sure, because again, he is at risk. He's had techs that he's worked with that have become positive. So, that way, if he is bringing something home, there was a period where he was exposed to someone who had COVID. And for that entire week, the only room that we use in common is the kitchen. So he wore a mask in the kitchen. Just in case he breathed on the counter and I touched the counter and then touched my face. So if you've been exposed to somebody who has COVID and you are not sick, you should still wear a mask in the house around other people. Okay. If you do develop symptoms, the ideal thing to do is to be in your room by yourself. Again, I realize that not everyone has the luxury of having more than one bathroom. Okay. But if you do, you use one bathroom, everybody else uses the not you bathroom. Okay. In a perfect world, you would not be coming out to get food. Somebody would leave the food at the door. You would open the door when they are gone. You would grab it, you would eat it, you would put it back out, like room service, right? And then the person picking up that thing, if they want to pick it up with their hands, that's fine. They just cannot touch their face before they wash their hands, right? So that was an incredibly long answer.
I've also got a question about on the subject of cohabitating and sharing spaces with other people. So of course I am lucky enough to live alone. Like everything that you've just described is kind of like, yep, check, check, check. Like, oh yeah, leave the food at my door. I mean, I just yesterday I ordered for one of my favorite vegan restaurants. They brought it to the door. I opened the door for a second, grab it, I'm good. However, I had been perfectly isolating this entire time, and then I think just around 3.5 months into isolation, I just needed a hug. I needed human interaction again, and so I picked one friend, my friend Drew. And he's the only person who I have over, the only other person I socialize with. Now, Drew has had COVID and then recovered, which will lead to a question that I would also like to ask, which is like, does that make someone safer? I already kind of know the answer is basically no. But no, he does not live alone. No, he's not also maintaining a perfect quarantine or anything like that. For me, it's just I'm minimizing the number of people that I'm hanging out with.
Right.
And then I have a new drag daughter. His name is Jonathan. So he and I have also been hanging out. And so that's it. For me, it's just been those two friends are the only people I hang out with. I know that is a risk. I know that right there I have increased my risk. And especially since they don't live alone and they're, and like not like they're out and about and carrying on like there's no pandemic. I mean, each of them is responsible.
They're not going to those that island where all those people weren't wearing masks and partying.
Oh yeah, but that was a private island, and everyone had just been tested. That meme that people were circulating, and then it turns out someone's like, this is Playa del Carmen, like this is like Tulum or like, or there. It's not a private island. That's just not a thing. But so I guess part of me is asking sort of like a reality check or a wake-up call. Like, is that a horrible thing to be doing and I should stop hanging out with those two? Or should I just be getting tested regularly now that I have increased my risk factor there? And the other question, I guess, to fold into that is the question of if
immunity.
Someone had this and recovered from this and they now have antibodies, what do we know about whether that gives them immunity, and if so, for how long, and all of that?
We don't know about immunity. So when people have antibodies for a week or two, a month or two, they may have immunity. What we do know is that people lose their antibodies very quickly. So whooping cough is a disease that we get vaccinated for, but we need a booster every 10 years because we lose immunity to it. Mm-hmm. I had a rip-roaring case of chickenpox as a child. Weirdly, 2 years ago, they started struggling to find antibodies in my blood. Last year, kaput, no antibodies, and I had to get vaccinated. So I lost immunity. So over time, I lost immunity to it. So we do, that's why you got to get a tetanus shot every 10 years, right? Because you lose immunity to it. Mm-hmm. This is like months. So people have antibodies and then months later they don't have antibodies.
Yeah.
We have seen cases of people getting reinfected. The concerning thing is there was recently a case of a gentleman who got reinfected, and the second time he was sicker than the first time. Right? What we were hoping was going to happen is, yeah, you might get sick again, but it's going to be like mild because your body, there'll still be some immunity, right? He had proven COVID the first time, mild symptoms. The second time he was hospitalized. Now, he was discharged after 4 or 5 days. I want to say he was hypoxic. He needed oxygen, but never needed a ventilator or anything like that. I don't remember the details of the case, but he was clearly sicker the second time around. So there is very clearly something about this virus that is just playing with our immune system in a way that we don't understand. Mm-hmm. Now, to speak to what you were talking about with what you've done behaviorally, this is sort of where it becomes a challenge because you're not going, well, I went to this party and then I went to a bar and things like that. So we do understand that human connection is important, right? For our psychological state, our mental well-being. It is obviously risky. I mean, there's no getting around that, right? There is no risk if you are not around people, right? There is risk if you are around people. Are there things you can do to minimize that risk? Sure, that you're not doing right now. So it's not like I have been by myself the whole time. I mean, I'm a loner. So the first 6 months I was like, what? I can't go out except to do like work related things and other stuff. I have to be at home with the dog. Darn.
Same.
You know? So, but like I acknowledge that not everyone is like me. I mean, I don't eat out very often. So I don't even care about, you know, I mean, I'll eat out maybe once a month. So I didn't care about Uber Eats or DoorDash, or I mean, I don't even know if those are the names of the companies, but you know, it was never a problem for me that I couldn't sit down and eat at a restaurant. It wasn't something I was doing routinely. But I have gone out maybe 3 or 4 times to meet friends. We always meet outside. We still sit 6 or so feet apart. We always have a mask with us because it's not just because if something comes up and we have to get closer together, I want to be able to protect my friend and she wants to be able to protect me. It's also, I don't know who else is around us because now we're outdoors, right? If we're indoors, unless someone breaks down your door, you're controlling who's in your house, right? But obviously being outside is a lower risk because your air conditioning is circulating air within your house, right? So if Drew is asymptomatic but comes over and has now lost his immunity and is carrying, theoretically, he is spreading particles in your house that you can then inhale, right? Now, if you wear a mask indoors, that's better. I have done one thing that is not, I mean, it is a slightly increased risk. I'm not sharing information that I'm not allowed to share. I was interviewed for a documentary, The End of Medicine, the documentary that Alex Lockwood is doing. He won the BAFTA for 73 Cows. This was kind of like people found out about it in the news because it's the one that Joaquin Phoenix and Rooney Mara are executive producing. So the title of it is The End of Medicine as We Know It. We filmed indoors. The crew wore masks the entire time. I wore a mask until it was time to be filmed. The crew were all 6 feet away from me. I mean, there was like a microsecond where I had to walk past one of them to go to the bathroom, right? But other than that, they were more than 6 feet away from me. So was that a risk? Sure. Was it a risk that I was willing to take and they were willing to take, even though they just got on a flight? Like they were more of a risk to me than I was to them. I was willing to take that risk because I believed in the project, right? But at the end of the day, it wasn't like a super, super high risk, right? And we were together maybe an hour, you know? And so time also makes a difference. So if there's a way that you can minimize that, you know, are there, for example, I've seen pictures of Central Park and other parks in New York where people are outside, but they're not packed, right? Like they're socially distancing. So I don't know if that is the case where you live, but you know, going outdoors with people is probably a better idea.
Yeah.
Because then you can distance yourself. But I don't know how New York is now. Like the one time I went to New York, I was anxious because I don't like being around crowds and like the streets were crowded, right? Because it was New York. So, but I'm assuming right now that's not the case since everything is shut down.
Yeah, I mean, not. I mean, it depends on when you're talking. Like, shortly after the gyms closed down, I remember normally when I go running, it's late at night. Shortly after gyms closed down, I went running during the day, and it was almost like you had to wait in line to run. Like, the running track was like so packed. It was just everyone was there. And I remember I got a little nervous because I was just like, here's a bunch of people physically exerting themselves, and there's bicyclists and there's joggers, and I just thought, this that didn't feel safe. Also, you just made me remember something else that I sort of, so of course I'm in recovery, and so as such I go to meetings and haven't been able to this whole time, aside from Zoom meetings, but I had a friend of mine who was like, oh, I'm on my way to an in-person meeting, and I just thought, I can't say no. And it's like a block from my apartment. It was in the park, and everyone was sitting.
It was in the park, so it was outdoors?
It was in the park, yes, so it was outdoors.
Okay.
Everyone's sitting in a circle. However, as soon as everyone sits down, they take their mask off. And I'm like, there's no reason to have taken your mask off, but they take their masks off. And people are not 6 feet apart. Like, we're sitting in a circle.
Yeah, that's not a good plan.
Yeah, so having been there, and I thought, oh, this will be awesome, I'll come back next week, but I wasn't even letting myself say it to myself at the time. I just kind of wanted to be like, yay, awesome, I'm glad to be here. And then when I walked away, I just kind of thought, like, that did not feel safe to me. So
the Infectious Diseases Society of America and the CDC have actually generated this graphic that will tell you the level of risk of individual actions. So for example, eating indoors is a higher risk thing than eating on a patio, or picking up food or things like that. And, we do want to do those things because it's like the goal. I don't want small businesses to close. I have actually bought more food in the last 8 months than I ever would normally, simply because I don't want them to close. Yeah. It's not like no business is in business because of me, right? Like, that's just never been the case. Yeah. But I knew that other people weren't going to be buying as much, and so I did that stuff. So, if you have an option between eating in or taking out, take out. Yeah. That's the better thing to do. Like, there was a group in one of the local vegan things in Atlanta, and they were like, hey, let's do a game night. Who wants to do a game night? And a bunch of people were like, yeah, that's a great idea. And we were all like, what the hell are you talking about? This is a terrible plan. And, they were getting really, admittedly, we're strangers on the internet telling them that they're being really dumb. So they got kind of defensive, and they're like, well, we need social interaction. And I'm like, with complete strangers. Like, you have to have social interaction with complete strangers whose risk you don't know. That makes no sense to me. Right? So the people that I have hung out with, I knew what their risk was because I know what their social situation is. As an example, one of my friends was like, hey, we're going to get together. We plan to get together on this weekend. And he goes, okay, well, yeah, that'll be perfect because I'm going on this wine tour with a friend of mine, on Thursday, and then we'll get together Saturday. And I was like, no, we will get together 14 days after your wine tour is over. Because I had no idea how crowded the wine tour was going to be or anything. Right. So I was just like, what you are doing is a slightly increased risk, or maybe a high risk. I don't know because I'm not in that situation. So the safest thing for me to do is wait to see if you have symptoms. And then if you don't, then we'll get together.
So what I'm hearing in that is, it's an acceptable risk. That doesn't mean it's not a risk. And maybe
well, that's a personal thing. So for me, what you're doing, I would not do what you are doing.
Right.
I would not have someone come to my house because for me personally, that is not an acceptable risk. You and I are different people. We have different needs, right? So that's where it gets a little bit more personal, and it becomes more of a, what risk are you willing to incur?
Yeah. I guess that's what I meant. Not acceptable, but but I guess one thing that might be helpful would just be to have a conversation with each of those two people and just to ask them, so here are my risk factors. Because, I can tell you exactly like my doorman, every now and then, like, I'll be talking to one of them and they'll, like, go to show me something on their phone, and like they'll come close up to me, and I'm like, I can see it from back here. It's fine. And just stay 6 feet away. But
I mean, look, honestly, a 5-second interaction, unless someone's coughing on you, is not nearly as risky as some people think, right? I mean, we think, we don't know.
Yeah.
We think you need like 10, 15 minutes of, dedicated interaction, but can I guarantee that 30-second interaction wasn't all it took? No.
Interesting. Well, so but I mean, there's my doorman, there's the occasional delivery person, there's the person maybe I see once or twice a month at the grocery store. Like it's very limited interactions, and I can tell you exactly which interactions I've had. So maybe just go over that.
And now indoors, if you're all wearing masks, that does reduce risk.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So you know what I mean? Like, is it perfect? No, because again, you're indoors, but it does reduce risk if everyone's wearing a mask and they're indoors.
Yeah.
So there are ways that you can mitigate that risk. I'm just saying, is it zero risk? Of course it's not zero risk. Zero risk is you in your house by yourself, right?
Yeah.
And that's not realistic for everybody. So, if you're in a family of 5 and they're all working outdoors, no one's saying everyone in the family should wear masks at all times indoors, right? Yeah. But you sort of know what your family's risk is, right? You can't necessarily guarantee what your friend's risk is.
And when you say family, I realize you're talking about household, but speaking of family, one of the other things I was thinking of is, if you'd asked me in March when I thought I'd be seeing my family next, I would have thought, well, I guess I won't be able to see them till Christmas. And now I've just accepted, like, I will not be flying home for the holidays. And even if I did, I am one of 5 kids. Each of my siblings has 2 or 3 children. All of them are in school right now. Each of my
like in-person school?
What's that?
In-person school?
Yeah. Like they're but they're staggering the schedule and they're distancing. They're trying to make it work, but I just don't get. Honestly, my belief is that the reason they're pushing for it is just because they need somewhere to put the kids during the day while the adults go back to work. I mean, I don't think anyone's calling it that.
No, I mean, look, that goes back to the system, right? That goes back to the problem with the system, right? I mean, we do not have a system in which if a pandemic occurs and people with kids need to be at home because now their kids need to school from home,
right?
We're basically saying you're expendable. Your teachers are expendable.
Right.
Right? The NBA can get immediate testing, 15-minute testing, but our teachers cannot. I mean, what is wrong with that system?
Wait, why aren't we even okay? Well, it gives me such a headache. At any rate, I think it's just a given that I need. I don't think my family is expecting me to come home for the holidays. I'm sure it'll probably be a difficult conversation for them, but part of the other reason is I know if I fly home, my mom is going to want to give me a hug. I know if I fly home, my parents are not, we're not going to quarantine for 14 days. What's the point of even doing it if everyone else is breaking quarantine? I know it's going to be masks off and we're all in a room having a meal together.
I mean, that's a challenge. There was that case of the doctors who had invited their family over and they did some stuff outdoors and then 5 of them got sick. Mm-hmm. It's like these 2 anesthesiologists, I want to say in South Carolina or something. Yeah. And they weren't trying to be jerks. I mean, they were doctors. They understood the risk. They weren't anti-masking, trumpet, non-believers. They just really didn't think they had risk. And at the time, we didn't realize that asymptomatic people can spread it and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
So, I've had friends go visit their family. So there are things that they do to mitigate risk. And again, this is where it's such a personal thing. I'll have patients ask me things sometimes. I'm like, this is such a personal decision. I cannot tell you what is okay and what is not, because we all have different levels of risk aversity, right? So I am very risk averse. So, but I've talked to my sister about coming down here She's a teacher. She works in a school that is an in-person school, but she's an administrator. So she doesn't have as much interaction with the kids. She has her own office. Her kids are being taught from home. They're old enough to be at home by themselves. You know, they've thought about coming down here for Christmas. They're not going to fly. They're going to drive. Right? So there are things that you can do to mitigate risk. So I have a friend who has had to go visit her family a couple times because there have been some illnesses, not COVID related illnesses. They drove because obviously driving is lower risk than flying because it's just you in the car, and the things that are riskier, like, you know, touching the gas thing, which you can always use hand sanitizer or, you know, something like that after you've touched it. Right. So that's the risk that comes in, but it's not being on a flight with that jerk who decides that in order to skirt the rules about wearing a mask, he's going to eat that grape for 2 hours on a plane. Right. So, you know what I mean? So like, there's always the risk with flying is that you can't control how stupid other people are, right? In a car, you can. The challenge for you is because you're going back to cold country, you can't be like, and I'll go stay in a hotel, and then that way I'll just hang out with my family outdoors because you'll all get frostbite, right? Like, that's not an option, right? If they come down here, they can stay in our house. We're more of a risk to them than they are to us. And we can go outdoors and do things and still have fun. That's a little bit more of a challenge for you. So really what it comes down to is, if you decide the risk is worth taking, how do you mitigate that risk? Do you mitigate that risk by saying, I am not going to go at Christmas time when everyone else is going. I'm going to go mid-January when no one is going to be there. Right? Because then the 14 days that my family's been around my other family have already passed. So I'll know how healthy they are, right? I mean, there are workarounds that are still going to be more risk than staying at home. And that's, again, where it comes into how risk averse are you. And if you were, you know, and look, I mean, my parents have both passed on. If I had an opportunity to see my mother and she had COVID, I would still go see her. Do you know what I mean? If it meant seeing my mother one more time, I would risk my life to do that happily.
And not to be like, you know, too, what's the word, macabre? But like, that's part of the question is like, at the time of a pandemic with the family as large as mine, I have to start wondering, like, I don't know how long it will be before I can see them again. And with this thing going around, I have to wonder, will all of them still be there when it is time to be able to go back? Yeah.
I mean, you know, so the things to think about are, if you don't feel comfortable going when everyone else is there, is there a time you can go when it won't be everybody else?
Yeah. Yeah, possibly. Yeah, maybe. I'm trying to think now how I could make it work. Of course, here's the thing, though. I know me. As soon as I cross a line, the line doesn't exist for me anymore. And as soon as I hung out with Drew and Jonathan, I found myself saying yes to a friend of mine on Facebook. I saw that he was moving, and I asked if I ended up helping my friend move. Fast forward to here I am, and for some reason in my mind, the way this works, I know that this makes no sense. In my mind, the way this works is I wear my mask until I get over to your apartment. Now, once I'm indoors, now we can both take our mask. That just makes...
That makes no sense.
No sense. And yet that is how I was operating. And it was... I can get how for some people they just can't muster the stamina to abide by all this. Because even in my mind, I was like, yeah, well, I'm already here, so... And then he didn't tell me he had 2 other people coming over to help him move. And so now we're like eating. So like there's me, I'm one of 4 people in a small kitchen just sitting here eating. And as if it's not bad enough, one of them, she's talking about like, you know, thinking that this, it's being overhyped and herd immunity. And you know what? I hate to say it, but some people just gotta die, right? and like looking at me, like laughing as if like I should be on
Those
her side.
people
And
are
I'm like,
very high risk because those people are not doing anything that they're supposed to be
yes,
doing.
exactly.
So the way to think about it, in
Yeah.
my opinion, the way that I think about it is the way that I think about STIs to some degree,
yeah,
right? So if you have sex with somebody new, you're not just having sex with that person, you're having sex with everyone they've had sex with, and then everyone that those people have had sex with, right? So similarly, if you're in a room with someone, you're not in a room just with that person, you're in a room theoretically with everyone they've been in a room with, right? So the reason, again, to wear a mask when you are indoors is a higher risk than outdoors. Outdoors is not zero risk, right? I mean, you can't just be like those rallies that Trump's doing. Those aren't zero risk. Those in some ways are probably higher risk than 2 people in a room, right? Because there's like 700 people and no one's wearing a mask. But, you know, the key is when you wear a mask outdoors, you are protecting other people from you, and to some degree you're being protected from them. But that need to be protected still exists when you are indoors with people you don't live with, right? So it's definitely, you know, I would say, I mean, look, that's a hard question to, it wasn't really a question. The way that I would sort of counsel you if you were my patient is, you know, for me, it's easier in some ways than it is for someone like you, because I know what the consequences are. Mm-hmm. I know what it is. Not that I have personally had ARDS, but I see people with ARDS for a living, right? I know how much they suffer, right? So like, here's a dumb example. I really wanted to kick diet soda for many, many years, and I wasn't doing it. Mm-hmm. And I do not drink soda anymore. I mean, I think I've had like 2 sodas in the last 8 years. And the way that I kicked soda was, the week that I was rounding in the neuro ICU, we had 3 devastating strokes come in. Like, I mean, these people were going to die, but they were going to die miserable, long, agonizing deaths. Like, they had just enough function that they were going to live a long time, but it was going to be like in a coma, or they weren't going to be able to move, and they weren't going to be able to swallow, and they weren't going to be able to recognize anybody. And like, this is the kind of thing that I fear, right? And that same week, an really good study came out that showed that women have an increased risk of stroke from drinking diet soda. And I was like, oh, I'm done. Like, that was it. There was no problem after that, right?
Wow.
And so I think sometimes for physicians, it's easier or nurses, because we see the really bad stuff. And so we know what we are trying to avoid.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't know if that will help you to think about those things, to think about the ARDS and the potentially really bad outcomes. I mean, it's just such a hard question to answer. There's no way for me to, you know, like, I can't be like, yeah, it's fine. No, it's not fine, right? I mean, if you were going, like, the meeting that you had, that's not fine, because that's not 3 people. That's 15, 20 people, not 6 feet apart, not wearing masks.
Easily, right?
That's
25 people.
Right? That's very clearly not fine.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that was your fault. You had no idea that that's what was going to happen. I'm just saying that is a clear example of not fine, right? But when it comes to the other stuff, that's where nuance and risk aversion comes in, right? Like, how averse are you to the risk that you have? Yeah. And for someone like me, who for a living sees just the worst of the worst, right? It's why, like, this is another dumb example, but for many, many years, I was really anti-bariatric surgery. And the reason I was anti-bariatric surgery was because all I ever saw were the people that showed up in my ICU with really bad outcomes, right? Which is like a minuscule percentage of the people who get bariatric surgery, right? Yeah. And it wasn't until I started researching it and talking to bariatric surgeons that I was like, oh no, bariatric surgery is actually valuable, and it can actually really save people's lives. You know, things like that. But for the longest time, I was like, oh my God, like, you know, all I could think was anesthesia risk, and, you know, they're going to end up in my ICU, and then they're going to die, and, you know, they're going to die on the vent, because that's what was happening to the patients that I saw. So, you know, for me, like, I think of things like the ARDS that I see, and the people on lifelong oxygen, and, you know, like, I mean, that's literally my job. I mean, like 50% of my patients come to clinic short of breath on oxygen. And and so, one of the things that I tell, like for example, my patients that have advanced COPD, when they come in with their family, I make the family do a very simple exercise. Okay. I make them take in a deep breath and then hold it. So go ahead and do that. Now breathe in from that point. Do not breathe out. Now breathe in again. Keep breathing in. Do not breathe out. That is what many COPDers feel like every single day. Right? So imagine that degree of dyspnea because you have ARDS, right? So that's sometimes how families can understand a micro moment of what their family members are experiencing.
Oh my God.
And because I do this for a living, I see that. So I don't know if it helps you to kind of think about, God, I'm young and I don't really have significant risks. I mean, you and I have talked about what your risks are. Mm-hmm. But do I really want to risk any, like if there's, so for some people, it's like, some people aren't risk averse and they're like, if it's only a 5% chance, I'm willing to do it. I'm like, no, because all I can think of is that 5% chance of badness, mm-hmm. right? Because it's so bad,
yeah.
And I don't know what the right answer is, but I mean, the goal to me is if you're going to do something, first of all, ideally stay within CDC guidelines. And you have done that so far. But if you're going to do something, find the least risky way of doing it, mm-hmm. staying within the guidelines. Yeah. That's what I would say.
I think with having friends over, I mean, I guess the fact that it is only those two friends I'm having over, that is its own risk reduction. Because I'm setting a hard limit on how many people I'm willing to socialize
right.
with. However, once I said okay to having the second person over, I had a coffee date. It was supposed to be a coffee date, socially distanced, like outside. Nope, it ended up, I was like, oh, just come on upstairs and then we'll go out. And then we just never ended up going out. And then then the next day, someone else. And then the next day, I help someone move and I'm with 4 people. As soon as I crossed that line,
so okay. I would say judgment of yourself doesn't help anybody, right? Like you can't change what's happened in the past. Yeah. But you've acknowledged that there are concerns that you yourself have with your behavior. Mm-hmm. So just take a deep breath, reassess, and figure out what can I do now tangibly to go forward, as opposed to like beating yourself up about the past doesn't change the past.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Thinking about it and saying, okay, well, yeah, I mean, I see that what I was doing, because clearly you're torn about it. Like, this isn't like I did it and I don't care. You're bringing it up because you are concerned about it.
Yeah.
So I would say, think about ways that you can change that. Hey, you know what? The next time I have somebody upstairs, we're going to wear masks indoors. Mm-hmm. I am not going to, when I set a rule that I'm meeting somebody that I don't know, that I've met online or whatever the case may be, I'm not going to invite him up because I know that's what's going to happen, because you and I will like talk for 3 hours, right? So I assume It was the same with, so, knowing that about yourself, maybe you can go, you know what, we're definitely going to go out.
Yeah.
And we're going to sit outside. So if we're going to sit outside for 3 hours, fine, but at least we're outdoors. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious, because we've been going for 3 hours now. Are you going to put all 3 hours up for people? I'm fine with it. I'm just curious.
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think, having everything that you said was useful. Having Joni have a chance to ask some questions that other people at home might be thinking. And then I find this part here especially useful. So I'll gladly be putting this up. Once we end this, that's when the Zoom call. I forget. I guess I can use the broadcast version and the Zoom link. But yes, I'll be putting it all up.
Okay.
Well,
I mean, and look, if people contact you later and they're like, "Man, I could not get through 3 hours," but this is my question.
Yeah.
Right. If it hasn't been addressed in our thing, because if it has been addressed, just tell them to watch it, right?
Sure.
But if it hasn't been addressed, just, we can do another Q&A where all we do is answer questions.
Oh, great. Sorry, I love that idea.
I just want to make sure this isn't the ICU, because I'm getting like 18 texts at the same time.
Okay.
Oh, nope. All right. I had a terrible call from the ICU right after the call with you, and terrible in the sense of doing organ donor management is a passion of mine. It means that we get more organs placed, less people are dying on the list, and that means less animals are being tortured, because unfortunately there's this idea that, I mean, like, I know some vegans who are like, I'm never going to donate my organs because I don't want them going to a non-vegan who's then going to survive and eat more animals. And I'm like, look, I definitely understand not necessarily wanting to support that. I get that. The reality, though, is human beings are never just going to let random people die on the list, right? That's just not how humanity works.
Yeah.
So we're going to do horrible, ghoulish things to animals in an effort to keep people from dying on the list. And we're already doing those things, right? So we're growing livers in sheep to see if we can transplant them and things like that. So I would much rather just have the humans donate the organs so that we're not growing livers in sheep, right? So for me, that's another reason why it's an important thing. But it can be heartbreaking when, like I said, I'm seeing more drug overdoses than I've seen before. I'm seeing more suicides than we normally see. I mean, typically the major causes are going to be trauma, like head trauma, stroke. That's a really common one, whether it's a hemorrhagic stroke or an ischemic stroke. But sometimes we'll see gunshot wounds to the head, things like that. But I'm seeing more stuff related probably to depression and isolation and things like that. So that really sucks. But it really sucks when I get called about kids.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah. So.
Well, to end things on a positive note, can I ask, we talked by phone halfway through your watching the movie, but you've now since watched I, Tanya, which I've seen maybe 30, 40 times. What did you think of the rest of the movie?
I really liked it. You had said that there was going to be this one statement that was going to get me, and I don't know if this was the part that you were talking about, but the thing that hit me is where she basically accuses the audience of being one of her attackers.
Yes.
And I was like, holy crap, that is totally true.
Powerful.
Like
you were saying, that's the moment I had where I was like, oh my God, I absolutely, I don't know her, and I took part in demonizing her.
I mean, online wasn't a thing back then, but I definitely judged her and thought she was a horrible human being. And I'm sure I thought at some point, oh God, she's just white trash. I mean, just horrible things, right?
Yeah.
And you look at her life, and even if only 5% of what she went through is true, right? If only 5% of that is true, talk about adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah. Wow. What a way to bring it home. Yeah.
I mean, when I started learning about adverse childhood experiences, it has completely changed the way that I look at patient care. There's something called trauma-informed care that we do. That really, so like I know doctors who, for example, when someone is struggling to stop smoking, or they're struggling with addiction, if you ask them, were you abused as a child, whether that was physical, emotional, sexual? Did you witness drug use in your home? Did you witness domestic violence in your home? Did you have a family member that was in prison? And because of systemic racism, if you are a Black child, you are far more likely to have a family member in jail, right? Because a Black person with a dime bag of weed is going to get 20 years. Right. A white person is going to get nothing. Their car's not even going to be searched, right? So like I remember my friend telling me about something that somebody had called into a radio show and they didn't know what to do, and it was white parents, and they were like, we don't know what to do. Our kid was pulled over, and his car is in the impound lot, and he was driving recklessly, and he was clearly stoned, right? And my friend was listening to this, and she was like, how is this dude's car not searched? Right? Because if he had been a Black child or a brown child, his car would definitely have been searched, and he would have been arrested, right? Yeah. So, so things like that necessarily mean that if you are a Black, Indigenous, or person of color, you absolutely have experienced adverse childhood. You have a higher ACE score than somebody else will, and that's not to say that white people don't struggle and that people who come from poverty aren't struggling. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying, statistically speaking, we know that the likelihood that you are going to have an adverse childhood experience is higher in people of color simply because of things they can't control.
Right.
So I'm not suggesting that there's more domestic violence or there's more drug use or sexual abuse or emotional abuse. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying just the one childhood experience of, do you have a family member in jail?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
and I mean, yeah, I can say yes to some of those things myself, some of those adverse childhood experiences, but even more than that, I'm hearing all of the things that I'm like, nope, didn't have to deal with that, never even had to think about that, and that is what just really shows me just like what a huge difference it is, especially when you're talking about how much it shows up in medicine and someone's
Yep.
overall quality of life. I mean, imagine.
it's not the whole picture, right? Because addiction isn't just about ACEs, but we do know that if you have a higher ACE score,
Yeah.
one of the because you're not able to cope with all these horrible things, right? So we know one of the coping mechanisms is early drug use, early sexual experiences, early smoking, things like that. But we also know that people who have mental illness, people who are depressed, people who are bipolar, they will self-medicate, right? So people who are alcoholics are generally just self-medicating, right? They're not bad people or weak people. They're self-medicating for something.
I know a few who are bad people, but
I mean, they might be, but I'm saying it's sort of a chicken and egg situation, right?
Yeah.
Are they bad people because they're alcoholics and they have no impulse control, so they're doing horrible things? Like, I read about this addiction case where this guy basically was persona non grata in his family, and when he was sick in the ICU, his family was just like, we don't care what happens to him, like make it as painful as possible. And the doctors were like, oh my God, his family is horrible. But it turns out when their mother was in severe pain from stage 4 cancer that had gone to her bones, which is one of the most painful places that cancer can go, the doctors couldn't understand why her pain meds weren't working. And it was because he had taken them.
oh God.
Right? He was an addict and he had taken his mother's opioids.
I feel like I've heard that story, or a similar story at least.
I mean,
my
there's
God.
stories like that are legion, right? So
Ugh.
people taking their family member. I mean, one of the big things that, when the opioid crisis hit, that doctors were supposed to do and counsel patients on is, don't keep this in an unlocked cabinet.
Yeah.
Don't keep this somewhere where other people will know about it. If you have children, don't let them know you're on it. Right? Things like that. I mean, I never gave that particular advice because I'm always like, well, what if you overdose? Like, your kids kind of need to know that you're on opioids,
Yeah.
right?
I guess know which kid you're telling.
Right. But I mean, kids are dumb, right? Their brains haven't fully developed. So you can't
Sure.
really expect kids to make great decisions. Right.
For what it's worth, before I was sober and in recovery, I remember like there was a period where like my between my two parents, they had some fantastic medications, and I remember like before I was sober, coming home and thinking like, oh, I wonder if I take a look through if I find anything. But that was when my mom was like, no, I'm just seeing my Chinese herbal acupuncturist. I'm off of all medications and I'm just taking the tea every day. And then when I'm sober and everything's off limits, now it's just like, well, what do you want? I got this.
Yeah.
Oh well, I guess I'm grateful now. It all worked okay.
Yeah. Well, listen, should we end it here before people are just like, oh my God?
I think if we end it right here, it will just be under 3 hours, at least on this OBS broadcast version.
Okay.
But yeah, and I also really like the idea of possibly doing one of these sometime where people can actually answer or ask questions.
Yeah, like where
as
I'm
well.
not talking unless like I'm only answering questions.
Yeah, you'll be like a human jukebox doctor. So
Yeah.
I don't know, put in some money and we'll donate it to the animals and then I'll talk.
Yeah, that's a
Awesome.
great idea.
Well, I'm so glad that we did this finally.
Yes.
For those who are watching, she had to ask so many times and remind me so many times, and just you were so incredibly patient it's hard to maybe understand why someone with ADHD, why doing something like this becomes about, yeah, but I haven't finished installing that one closet yet and blah, blah, blah. But it's kind of like, until all of these things are out of the way, I can't focus on the next thing. But I am much, much, much closer to being able to just spontaneously do stuff like this. So I'd love to start doing this more often.
Yeah. And listen, for anyone who makes it to the end, please donate, please share with people if you've already donated. Again, we talked a lot about COVID, but the goal of this was there is a farm sanctuary that is in dire straits right now.
Yeah.
As Lisa already mentioned, and she had to go, so she couldn't really go into detail about this, her major source of funding for Sweet Bear Rescue Farm has dried up. Many of you know her because she ran Sanctuary Brewing, and then there was the cafe, which I'm so sorry, I'm blanking on the name of. And that was her major source of funding for the farm sanctuary.
Yeah.
She is not a farm sanctuary that had, to my knowledge, like an anonymous donor or like a benefactor. And she has, the only reason I'm sharing this is, the only reason I know this is because she has shared this publicly. I think she put in her post that she only has 4 or 6 months, something like that, of funding for these animals. So these are animals that have been living together for years. And, you know, forget about, I mean, obviously Lisa would be emotionally devastated, but even if that's not something that bothers you particularly, which, I mean, I can understand, like, we're all here for the animals, right? We're vegan for the animals. So the idea that this family would be broken up is really heartbreaking. So if there's any way that you can donate, and I mean, look, I get it. I understand that people are hurting. If even $5, right? There's no amount that is too small because it all adds up.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I mean, I just think with everything that these animals have been through from which they were rescued,
right?
Them having to go through this too on top of all of that, I can only imagine like the trauma an animal feels if after their rescue and after finally settling in and being able to trust humans and establishing, okay, this is my family. And then to have that disrupted, I can only imagine if I were the animal, I would be like, oh my God, is it happening again? Like, is this... I don't even want to go there. I don't even want to think about that. But so please go to bigfatveganradio.com/donate link. And then that will take you to the other link. Do I still have that? What was her direct link? Did she say?
I think there was PayPal.me or PayPal me. I don't use PayPal, so I don't know. But it was like /kindness empire, I think.
Yeah, I think that was the one. Let me just try typing that in as well and see if that still takes me there. Yes, that takes me to this. So in the chat, I'm just going to add donate to.
Well, if you record it, I don't think it'll come up in the chat anymore, right?
Well, if the broadcast version that's automatically being saved to YouTube is the chat window, so it has the chat on the right side of the screen.
Got it.
Somehow in my head I thought we'd have it set up so you guys could see that too, but I think I'll probably just stitch them together just so that the video has all of that in there. But yeah, so paypal.me/kindness empire. At any point that you're watching this, please go there and make a donation, and spread the word and tell your friends, and if you go to their website, I'm sure there's all sorts of other ways you can help them as well. So yeah, thanks for that reminder.
And if you happen to be a famous person or know a famous person who's willing to become a benefactor, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. Start asking. I guess.
Like, does anybody know Woody Harrelson?
I'm going to start working on becoming a famous person just so that when I can, I'm going to be like, listen, find 10 sanctuaries. I'm just going to 100,000 a year to each of them.
How amazing would that be? That's like the dream. People are always like, if I won the lottery, I would run a sanctuary. I'm like, I don't know if I would do that because I feel like I would just be so stressed all the time, but I could happily fund them.
Yes. I mean, there's people out there that's what they want to do. And those are the same people that say, do not do this. Like, do not start up a sanctuary.
Right.
But rather, if you can help a sanctuary operate, and I've seen so many sanctuaries that over time, they're like, oh, we had an opportunity to buy up this 100 or 500 acres right next door, so we're going to expand, and now we have the
Right.
opportunity to hire people who can actually be full-time staff. Yeah, I would love to see Lisa get the help they need. So thank you again for thinking to include them on this.
Yeah, it's been really great. Thanks again.
Yeah. Oh, and hey, for people who want to find you, just shout out your social
Oh.
media.
I'm on Twitter occasionally. I'm at the Veg Doc on Twitter. I tend to be more on Instagram, and I'm at _ the Veg Doc. So slightly different addresses, but Instagram's the one I'm at mostly, and it is at _ the Veg Doc.
Yeah. And there we go. Have you ever messaged _ the Veg Doc to be like, hey, could I?
I haven't, I've thought about it, and then I'm just like, like that dude had it I don't know why he has it. He's not vegan, vegetarian, or a doctor,
Yeah.
but I just feel kind of weird to be like, I have the right to have this
Yeah,
because
you know
I am
what?
actually a vegan doctor.
But I wouldn't say message him and ask that, but or
Yeah.
say that. But you could certainly message him and ask.
I just feel like that's how it would come across no matter how I asked it.
Well, keep in mind who knows where in your life there may be other things that you've considered asking, and you're also thinking, oh, I couldn't ask that. I remember I once.
I mean, I'm a female in
Well,
America,
yeah,
and I'm Indian,
true.
so there's definitely
True.
times I've not asked things.
Absolutely. Well, then I realized that this is not actually going to translate as well then, because while I find this to be true, I also have to factor in like my maleness, my whiteness, my cisness. But I remember I noticed that like every time I assume the answer to a request is going to be absolutely not, and I ask anyway, I found about 3 or 4 out of 5 times the answer was yes with no question. It was like, oh yeah, sure. And I was like, if I'm not asking all of these things, God knows what else I could ask. But my first drag daughter, her name is Ali Ganza, and
We talked about this, and
Yes.
you asked for her name.
Yes, I asked someone on Instagram, had her name, and it was just like some guy somewhere in Africa, and I'm like, I don't know what this name means to you, but if you're not partial to it, there is a performer who really wants this name, and this is their stage name, and they loved, and it took like maybe a year before he even saw the message, but finally he was like, oh yeah, sure. And to
Yeah.
this day, that person even keeps in touch with me. I couldn't tell you what their name is now because it's some numbers and letters, but they messaged me to be like, hey, how's it going? How are things going on? Now, the real struggle is when I started Instagram, I never created a Ben Strothman account, and Strothman is a rare enough last name, even in
Right.
Germany, that like the Ben Strothmans of the world were aware of each other pretty much, like.
Yeah.
And the other most well-known Ben Strothman, other than me, I've written to him a few times. He's somewhere in Germany. He has Ben Strothman on Instagram, and I've messaged him several times. I'm like, look, I get that you don't use Instagram often, and the worst is he'll do like hashtag food porn, and none of it's vegan, so people are seeing Ben Strothman post all this non-vegan
You should
food.
take like the OG Ben Strothman or the Ben Strothman.
You know what? Yeah. In the meantime, but here's the other thing, and of course, I'll wrap this all up by talking about spreadsheets. I started a spreadsheet for all the possible drag names that I might one day want to give to drag daughters. So, what my favorite drag name, and apparently there's some queen out there who I think has started using this name, but I've been saying this name for 8 or 9 years. So, like, I am the originator of this drag name. But I've always thought the name Nina Levin would be a fantastic drag name. Welcome to the stage, Nina Levin. Who could ever forget Nina Levin?
Oh, not like 9/11.
There you go.
I was like, why would
50%
Nina
of
like
people never get it, and then like 2 weeks later they'll text me like, oh my god, it's awful,
Yeah.
it's horrible, terrible, but all of drag is
Well,
irreverent.
if you pronounced it, if you spelled it Nina, which is an actual Sanskrit name,
Yeah.
Naina, it would sound like 9/11.
Naina. Oh, Nina.
Nina
Ooh,
Levin.
Nina. But then that would be like, unless it's actually someone who can have a Sanskrit name, Unless it was just like
Yes,
some
thank you for
blonde
mentioning that.
Barbie.
It is a pet peeve. It is a
Hi,
pet
my
peeve
name
of
is
mine.
Barbie, but my friends all call me Naina Saraswati. But
Yeah.
you can just call me Priya. It's fine.
Yeah, yeah.
But and the other name I came up with, there's at least two drag names I know of, or two drag queens whose first name is Kenya, like the country, and I
Yeah.
thought Kenya Not would be
That would be amazing, yeah.
brilliant drag name. But there's a drag queen in the UK I found who now has that name. But in the meantime, I started a spreadsheet so that every one of these names, in case I want to give this name away to a drag queen one day, I've already got the Gmail, the Twitter, the Instagram, the Twitch, the YouTube, the Periscope,
Yeah.
everything. I'm buying them up. Not buying them, but I'm taking them all. And then I'm also keeping track on this spreadsheet of what is my username or email on each of these, and what is my password on each of
Right.
these, and which Gmail address do I use to log in. And then I have more than one for each name, because I have like the Nina Levin and
Yeah.
Kenya Not Queen. But yeah, I need to
Yeah,
do
I mean,
that for Ben
I did that
Strothman.
with I did that with the Veg Doc for everything. I got a Gmail, and I even got the domain, and then I got Veg Doc as well in case people got confused. Not that I have my website up and running,
Mhm.
And then I did Twitter, and then recently, like, I was like, maybe I should get a TikTok account, and then I did, and then I heard all about the security issues with TikTok, so I was like, maybe not. And whatever, like, I'm not a TikTok person anyway, but
Yeah.
the one that just didn't work out is this guy just happened to have it. I should just message him and be like, hey, does this have a deep significance to you? If it doesn't,
Yeah.
I already have this name on Twitter. I'd love for them to be the same.
Yeah.
But honestly, I just feel like it's not that hard to put an underscore in front of it for this one account. But anyway,
But
I don't know
you
how we
never
got on
know.
this
You
topic.
might-
I should really let you get going.
You might want to ask him and see what he says. And in the meantime, the Ben Strothman is not taken, so I am taking the Ben Strothman
There you
on
go.
Instagram.
There
I'm
you
going to
go.
go and snatch it up. So thank you for
Awesome.
that. All right.
All right.
I'll talk to you soon, and thank you again for doing this.
Yes.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.